Okay. Okay. Now, welcome everyone to our international conference on human rights and literature. This is our second day. We heard some very great presentations yesterday, and we will hear more of them today. And again, welcome our guest speaker, Professor James DAWES. And we are thankful for having him here. He will give us a speech about human rights and literature, the opening speech. Mr. DAWES is David Wallace Professor of English at Macalester College. He teaches literature and human rights. Professor DAWES is the author of 3 great books. First one, The Novel of Human Rights. Second one, Evil Man. And Evil Man, if I'm not wrong, it won the International Human Rights Book Award, right? Yes. So congratulations. And the third one is That the World May Know, Bearing Witness to Atrocity. Yes, the author of these 3 great books about human rights. And here is Professor DAWES. I leave you to his hands.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having me here. I'm always delighted to do things in Turkey. I'm actually visiting this summer my mother-in-law in Ankara, so perhaps I'll get a chance to pop by your campus and take a tour. So despite the time differences, I was able to attend the end of the conference yesterday, and it was really delightful to see. I'm just going to continue talking a little more generally about the ethical risks and responsibilities of human rights storytelling. And I'm going to focus in particular on what might be called the paradox of representing suffering, which is this: to stop people from being injured, we have to tell the story of what's happening, but in telling the story of what's happening, we often injure people. So I'll start with an anecdote. Not long ago, I was working in a working group with a psychologist who had served on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At one point, he pulled out of his suitcase a series of posters that he'd saved from that time, which had been distributed throughout South Africa to get people to participate in the commission as it was starting its work. These posters were very striking. They had a series of messages in horror movie font, so sort of grainy, all caps block letters, above requests to visit commission offices. One read, "If your mother was tortured, father murdered, and children abducted, would you be silent?" Another one, "Some of the crimes of our past, murder, abduction, torture. One of the crimes of our present, silence." And one more, "Revealing is healing." When the posters were initially distributed, the psychologists felt good about them. They were necessary to get people's attention and to pull them in. Without widespread attention, the commission simply couldn't work in South Africa. But when I met him all those years later, he was much more conflicted. The posters troubled him in 2 ways. First, they were emotionally coercive. They implied that there was some sort of moral equivalence between, on the one hand, a criminal conspiracy of silence around apartheid crimes, and on the other hand, the personal needs some survivors might have to keep their trauma private. Second, the posters promised a process of psychological healing that just didn't happen. Psychosocial support, counseling, and follow-up were just inadequate to the task, and many survivors were left only with reopened wounds. This psychologist was still struggling with the fact that the necessary and important moral good of the commission's work also came with some very real moral costs. So the work of human rights storytelling is full of hazards and unintended consequences like this. Lauren Wilcox has argued, for instance, that the fairly common tactic of using gratuitous images of violated bodies in human rights campaigns has produced classes of persons who are fundamentally defined by their vulnerability. She calls them subjects to be saved. And it's a real moral quandary. On the one hand, serious work against violence requires that we identify specific vulnerable populations and focus on their unique realities, their risks, capacities, their needs and resources. On the other hand, the identification of vulnerable populations can get dangerously close to rendering those populations equivalent to their vulnerabilities. And worse, it can reify classes of absolute identity that are defined by their binary opposition, the invulnerable and the vulnerable, the able and the unable, the whole and the broken. So a moral framework founded on the idea of our mutual capacity to suffer pain is really separated only by a thin line from a moral framework that understands survivors exclusively through their experience of pain. Many have argued, for instance, that it was precisely the success of previous sensational campaigns to generate sympathy in the West for crises in Africa that led to US and European apathy and disengagement during the Rwandan genocide. As Francois Mitterrand is reported to have said at the time, in those countries, genocide is not very important. As Mikao Muchua characterizes it, human rights is an international allegory that depends on a savage's, victim's, savior's model. At its very worst, this is the political narrative of human rights. Savages, so anti-democratic states, commit unspeakable crimes against powerless and innocent victims who are then dignified by the actions of white saviors. These white saviors, in turn, are defined by a pathology of self-redemption, that is, by this need to validate their own lives by defending what they perceive to be as lower peoples. So this is the kind of colonial background of human rights, and human rights storytelling still faces a range of risks and problems, from the sensationalization of violence to the enduring colonialist fantasies that Muchua diagnoses. There are deep historical and cultural roots to all these problems, and they stem obviously from centuries of misogyny and racism. What I want to talk about in the few minutes I have is a problem that sort of lies beneath all this or next to all this. It's a problem with our very basic conception of storytelling itself, a problem that is at the very heart of the contemporary model of human rights. Namely, our assumption, first, that narratives promote empathy, and second, that empathy works. So let's start with the assumptions. Here's the conventional way of thinking about storytelling and human rights. Stories turn distant strangers into kin. With each new story, a previously hidden or invisible form of suffering is exposed. A passage to India immediately altered British views on colonialism, and Uncle Tom's Cabin brought to the mainstream what had formerly been the outlier movement of abolitionism in the US. New stories like these teach us new sites of care, new sites of pain, and we instinctively respond to them. Stories train us how to act, they train us how to feel, they help us create alternative selves that are more courageous, more empathetic, more tender, and we yearn to be like those selves. Lynn Hunt is really the most popular spokesperson for this sort of view. She argues, in fact, that human rights as a modern movement was only made possible because of empathy-based evolutions in narrative practice. She claims, in fact, that human rights is derived from the principles of the 18th century Western Enlightenment, and this was made possible only by practices of storytelling, namely the invention of the epistolary novel. The most famous of these is Samuel Richardson's Pamela, and this novel disrupted gender and class binaries by making elite male readers in England identify and sympathize with the plight of a female maidservant. Hunt argues for something like an 18th century version of the CNN effect and says that the widespread reading of newly available dramatic novels like this that centered on the emotions of common individuals played a key role in inventing a new sense of empathy for physically or socially distant persons. Essentially, that this intense technology of identifying with other minds that the novel really brought into practice helped everybody see that we were all the same because we all had the same interior feelings, the same kind of emotional structures. And she argues, it is precisely these novels that made possible the very concept of the rights of man and human rights. So that's the conventional way of thinking about narrative, human rights, and empathy. But it's obviously also a deeply problematic one. First, it's of course deeply Eurocentric. It reduces the complex phenomena of global patterns in empathy, care, and identity to a very narrow slice of European history. Unsurprising that a historian of France would find that the most important things begin there. There's a kind of scholarly narcissism at work in a lot of human rights scholarship. And on top of that, the model of empathy it proposes is really kind of appalling. It is an appalling moral fact that empathy for strangers requires first the cognitive work of transforming strangers into people that we think seem like us. Empathy modeled upon imagined kinship redraws the boundaries of us versus them, but it still depends upon there being some kind of us versus them, some kind of acceptable other and some kind of unacceptable other. Empathy in this model of rights history is a concern in even more basic ways. Elaine Scarry argues, for instance, that empathy just generally doesn't work. It fails when migrating from the imaginary to the real, and these failures are not accidents. They're the necessary result of the weakness of human imagination. She writes, "The action of injuring occurs precisely because we have trouble believing in the reality of other persons. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a misleading example of the power of cosmopolitan imagining." So celebrating empathy is a mistake. If we don't attend to its deep problems, it actually stands in the way of meaningful action. This is not a new concern. Jean-Jacques Rousseau expressed a similar set of concerns as far back as 1758, when he was describing emotional responses to the theater. And it's a really remarkable passage, so I'll just read this one to you. Here's Rousseau. "In giving our tears to these fictions, we have satisfied all the rights of humanity without having to give anything more of ourselves. Whereas unfortunate people in person would require attention from us, relief, consolation, and work, which would involve us in their pains and would require at least the sacrifice of our indolence, from all of which we are quite content to be exempt. It could be said that our heart closes itself for fear of being touched at our expense. In the final accounting, when a man has gone to admire fine actions and stories and to cry for imaginary miseries, what more can be asked of him? Is he not satisfied with himself? Does he not applaud his fine soul? Has he not acquitted himself of all that he owes to virtue by the homage which has just rendered it? What more could one want of him? That he practice it himself? He has no role to play. He is no actor." But the problem of empathy isn't just that it's weak or ineffective or that it lets us off the hook from taking meaningful action. The problem is that it also causes wrong action. Scarry offers two competing models for understanding how the discovery of moral injustice can affect us. On the one hand, the shock of discovering we were blind to injustice in one place can dramatically increase our attentiveness to injustice in all locations. On the other hand, moral outrage can be exclusionary. Sincere focus on one category of violation can have the perverse effect of reducing our sensitivity to injustice elsewhere. Empathy misdirects us. In other words, even when empathy promotes action that is both good and effective, it can still be a failure. Psychologist Paul Bloom explains why we should treat this concern not as an accident of circumstance, but as a deep problem with the interior structure of empathy. His argument, in short, is that empathy is stupid. It makes us pay attention to narrative suffering and to ignore statistical suffering. That is, we pay attention to visible, individualized victims that we feel a personal connection to, and we ignore faceless masses of victims that we don't feel connected to. Empathy is innumerate. It doesn't understand numbers. It makes us squander attention and resources. In Bloom's favorite example for this, he describes how empathy will make whole populations clench up in spasms of action for a single named child trapped in a well, even as they ignore countless children struggling with hunger and homelessness directly around them. Nations do this all the time. They donate time and money to victims of spectacular catastrophes, even when time and money aren't very helpful, as happened in the 2004 tsunami, when Doctors Without Borders stopped accepting money for it, pleading instead for donations to less media-friendly crises. Ultimately, people like Scarry and Bloom argue that empathy is a roadblock to rationally compassionate action in the world. Empathy prefers problems that have clear and simple solutions. Complex problems are tiresome to empathy-driven actors. but it is precisely these complex problems that require our deepest attention. So we're already a minute over time. I'll just end with one thing to end on a slightly more optimistic note, because I do believe, as I'm sure most of the people in this conference believe, that despite all these problems, we're really clear about the moral duties and possibilities of rights work through storytelling. And the way I see it is we don't have really a solution so much as a responsibility to move forward, but with doubt. Storytelling is indeed a problem, but it's a problem that runs through all levels of human rights and humanitarian work. And there's this quotation that I recorded once in an interview I did with the former president of Doctors Without Borders, MSF, Ronja Brouwman, who was describing his career and describing the difficulties of it. And he said this: humanitarian action is defined by having to act, but having nothing but bad choices available. When one speaks of a failure, one implies there could be a success. I have a hard time imagining what humanitarian success would be in situations where violence itself is the sign of failure. As humanitarians, we inscribe ourselves in failure. And while that's a fairly disheartening quote on the surface, it's always struck me as the most durable form of hope as well. And with that, we're actually 2 minutes past 10:15, so I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this great presentation. Do you have any questions or comments on Professor Dorf's presentation? Questions, any comments?
Thank you so much, Dr. DAWES, for your insightful keynote speech. My question is, how can we foster the kind of optimism necessary to teach our students about human rights? How can we confront cynicism among our students about human rights and democracy? And you talked about storytelling and how it is a kind of slippery slope, and how optimism is a really necessary tool to deal with this kind of cynicism. That's my
I mean, that's such an important question. In the early stages of my career, I felt like it was my job to crush the optimism of my students, because they were all these young people who'd come in and they all thought they were going to change the world when they graduated. And when they encountered the very first difficulty, they would kind of collapse and quit because they just thought, I'm good. This work is good. It should work. So it seemed like I was inoculating them against the kind of easy failures that come from optimism. But as you point out with your question, everything seems so different now. There's such a lack of hope globally, and we're all just in a kind of hope starvation experiment. And I feel like hope is a moral responsibility right now. And as we were discussing just before we started, I was delighted to hear you talking with hope and smiling. My instinct would be to kind of feel dread and anxiety. But that hope is precisely why you all are on the verge of doing something really great someday. So I think it's just really being intentional about that as a moral responsibility. Hope is necessary. It's not naivete.
I have also a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. DAWES. I just came across one of your interviews, and in that interview, you mentioned that, I'm just quoting from you, empathy requires subjects to be saved, and for empathy to work, the novels need to have appealing and attractive and vulnerable victims. So the writer is creating a kind of cultural stereotypes. I'm just asking, I just wonder, you know, having empathy towards the vulnerable person, maybe it is the first step to understand, or at least be, I don't know, involved in the story of that victim. So if you're that pessimistic toward being, you know, empathetic to the victim, so what are the other alternatives would be Or do you have any kind of suggestion? I'm just curious, for example, in Afro-American literature, Black writers started, the issues of rape and these kinds of sexual assaults by creating characters who were victims at the first step, and then they go through healing process. So we do not see that kind of cultural stereotypes. So by creating a kind of empathy with those characters, maybe there is a chance for reader to be actually saved by reading those stories.
Yeah, that's a great comment and question. One way I think about it is this: so particularly with the novels in the Anglo-American rights writing tradition, there's just a preponderance of stories about beautiful women being harmed in some way, and the kind of like the direct damage to a beautiful woman is the center of a lot of these human rights stories. And it's this idea that if you have the ideal victim that inspires all sorts of interest and attraction, that you can move people. And while some of those novels, they're well intended and they do good work, they actually end up, I think, reproducing a lot of the logics of violence against women that they're purportedly against. And so it's not that people shouldn't write novels in which there are victims whose suffering is so intense and pull us in. But if it can kind of remain critically aware of how these patterns develop and how they can go from being one novel to hundreds of novels that solidify this notion of, say, women as categories of people that require saving by strong men, we can maybe then have a process where the worst examples of it fade away and the more effective examples remain.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
By the way, I really liked your talk yesterday.
Thank you. And I want to have a personal question from you. You told that your mother is Turkish, is that right?
My mother-in-law. She lives in Ankara.
Your mother-in-law, okay.
Yeah.
So you know that here we have got TÜBİTAK, an organization that is supporting having, academicians from around the world. So I just want to get a promise from you that we want to see you in person in Turkey. So we'll just cover your flight and your accommodation here for a week. So maybe you can have your talk here and our students will enjoy your seminars.
It would be a delight. In fact, I was in Istanbul just just last summer. So anytime.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll keep in touch with you then. Thank you.
Yes, well. Can we continue? Yes. Next speaker will be Arvi SEPP. And let me give you a brief background information about him. Arvi SEPP studied German and English literature, sociology, and literary theory in Leuven. And he is a professor in literary studies and translation studies at the University, and a research fellow at the Institute of Jewish Studies in Antwerp. His research interests center on comparative literature, 20th century German Jewish literature, literary translation, autobiographical writing. In the context of his research, he was awarded the Tauber Institute Research Award and the Prix de la Fondation Auschwitz. So Arvi SEPP's presentation will be about totalitarian state, power, and artistic intellectual in dictatorship. Okay, here is Arvi SEPP.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. So my talk will be about the role of literature in dictatorship. And I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Just a moment. I don't know if you can see my presentation. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we do.
Thank you very much. So indeed, I'm mainly specialized in Holocaust literature and literature. I mean, about the representation of genocide, and I very much enjoyed Professor Do's talk. There's one PhD student of mine who is working on the representation of the Nanjing massacre, and I mean, evil men. So Professor Do's publication, I mean, is part of I mean, of the foundation of this PhD. So I was very glad to hear the presentation too. But what am I going to do today in 15 minutes? So I want to talk about two novels, but frankly, I don't yet know if I will have enough time to talk about both of them. So I want to talk about a Swiss-German novel, which is called Ich werde hier sein im Sonnenschein und im Schatten, which in English translation means I'll be here in sunshine and in shadow. The novel has not been translated into English. And then a very famous novel from 1921 by Yevgeny Zamyatin, Мы, in Russian, We. And I will start with the second novel, so by Zamyatin. So I want to show how, as I said, I mean, what the position of literature is in totalitarianism, and We shows the relation between literature, imagination, and fiction in the totalitarian state. Yeah. So published in 1921. So this was, I mean, context of Stalinism, and in English translation translated as We, as I mentioned. So what is the novel about? So We is a dystopian novel. It takes place in the future, and the main character is D503. So all individuals are given numbers in the novel, and D503 is a spacecraft engineer who resides in the one state. So that's the name of the totalitarian state, one state, a largely glass constructed urban nation that aids in mass surveillance. So the structure of the state resembles a panopticon, and life is managed scientifically. People march and stride and are uniformly attired. And so the individual's behavior is determined by the one state's logical formulas and equations. And a central feature of totalitarianism, as we can also see in the novel, is that it always exploits art and literature for its propaganda purposes, whereas at the same time not tolerating any dissenting opinion or any ambiguity. And so in this context, Stalin's famous statement that the poet is the engineer of the human soul applies particularly well. How prophetic Zamyatin was at a time when, as early as in 1921, he assigned literature in general and poetry in particular one of the key roles in totalitarian society. In the novel, there is an execution scene where R13, again, so all people are given numbers, yeah? So R13 is a poet and a friend of D503. And a poet, a state poet, paid by the state, has to sing before the masses as a kind of introduction to the execution. We can read, the divine brazen rhythm droned droned on over the tribunes. In the yams, the houses tremble, spray up as liquid gold, collapse thundering. And then R13, so the poet, took his turn, pale as death, and he claimed, cutting swift trachea, sharp as a knife. Only after the poet had finished, the execution was carried out. It is remarkable that R13, the poet, is the one in the novel of whom the author puts the wisest and most daring statements into his mouth. Even before the execution scene, he tells his friend D503, leave me with your science. So again, D503 is a spacecraft engineer. Leave me with your science. This science is nothing but cowardice. You want to surround the infinite with a little wall and are afraid to look behind that wall. Yes, and when you look over, you squint your eyes. So in other words, R13 accuses science, which is usually considered visionary, of only confirming the status quo and not daring to look further ahead. He goes on to say that the one state has restored happiness to man. There is no longer good and evil. Everything has become uncomplicated and simple. The benefactor, the machine, the cube, the glass bell, the protector, all this is sublime and crystal clear. This description of the totalitarian regime is extremely visionary and ironic in intent, although the irony escapes his friend entirely. R13 finds himself in an impossible balancing act. He sees through the whole system, and yet he makes up part of it and is even used as its mouthpiece. And this, by the way, is in totalitarianism often the case. For example, in National Socialism, state poets were very important. They received, a huge amount of money to represent the state. So he is annoyed then that D503 congratulates him with his appearance during the execution. There is also in the Institute of State Poetry and Writers in One State. And D503 proudly reports that his society tamed and settled the once wild element of poetry. Today, poetry is not a sweet nightingale's sob. It is service to the state. It is something useful. And this, again, this usefulness, this kind of literature as a tool to educate, not without any ambiguity, without multiple modes of interpretation, is quasi-universal in totalitarian regimes. So this means then that literature as a mouthpiece of the totalitarian regime, or even of any regime, cannot and never can be considered. Sorry, I've missed a passage here. So Zamyatin, also in 1921, he wrote a famous essay, which is called I Fear. And in this, I just missed the quote in my presentation, but he writes in his essay that the most important thing, and I quote, that the most important thing is that real literature can only be where it is not made by compliant and reliable bureaucrats, but by madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, rebels, skeptics, unquote. So this means that literature as a mouthpiece of the totalitarian regime, or even of any regime, cannot and can never be considered real literature, in his opinion. It is striking how there is this very strong but ambiguous relation between fiction and totalitarianism. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt emphasizes how it is the task of totalitarian forms of organization, as well as of the state and the party, to, quote, transform the ideological fiction into reality and to organize people in the not yet totalitarian world in such a way that they move according to the laws of this fictitious reality. In we, there are only the state poets as artists. But the poet R13 is not coincidentally also an opponent of the single state. However, it would be more telling to expand the definition of the artists in this context, because it is not only this one poet who opposes the one state. I will skip some passages here because I want to move on to the second part of this talk about language and dystopia. Language, which is used differently, of course, by every individual, plays an important role in Zamyatin's novel. In we, language is no longer individual, but it is determined by the state. As usual, in the language of Stalinism, a kind of two-track train of thought is constructed, whereby everything the state does is good, and everything the state does not like is called bad. And there's nothing in between, of course. Although there are no capitalist opponents in the one state, the ideals of the democratic world are valued negatively, especially the concept of freedom. Freedom is equated with the irrational in the view of the one state. And there's also the narrator. The narrator cannot believe that everyone divided up that day as they wished, and sees this way of life as slow suicide. This negative evaluation of the ideals of the old world rests on the contrast between with the ideals of the new world of the one state, which, as explained earlier, is based only on reason and science. In that sense, all the ideals of the state, even in language, are basically good, regardless of the opinion of outsiders and the reader. So, I could tell a lot more about language in dystopian novels, but what is quite telling is that, I mean, D503, so the protagonist of the novel, reflects on lexical items that are or may not be problematic at all for the reader, but are for him. For example, he's taken aback when he hears that the uncivilized expression, unquote, my, so the possessive pronoun my, is in fact subversive, is seen as something subversive. He writes that he never heard anyone use it until his imagination brought him into the world of the irrational, expressions in which the individual and individual property are central are alien to him. The state demands rather a collectivizing language. Therefore, also the title of the novel, We, against individualism, of course. I think I will have to come to my conclusion. As I said, I kind of knew that maybe I wouldn't be able to talk about both novels. Maybe very briefly in a couple of minutes. So the other novel is a Swiss-German novel, a dystopian novel. It is also about kind of representation of Stalinism. So it depicts an alternate version of Swiss history in which Lenin did not depart Switzerland for Russia in 1917 to launch the Russian Revolution, but instead Lenin's revolution occurred in Switzerland, transforming it into the Swiss Socialist Republic, a communist state engaged in the colonization of Africa and in constant conflict with other totalitarian empires. But we can see a lot of similarities between both novels. But here we can see that literature has completely disappeared. Why? Because literature is, in fact, a representation of freedom. It has not, been instrumentalized like in We. It has just disappeared because there's no use for literature anymore. Because the ideal state has been realized. And this is, I mean, more or less, I mean, what is represented in Christian Kracht's novel. But as I said, I mean, I will wrap up here. What is very interesting in both novels, that we can see, I mean, literature, both in its presence and absence, is used by the political system to enforce its goals and intentions and to manipulate people. Okay, but I will wrap up here, and of course I would love to answer any question you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sepp. Do you have any questions and comments?
I was really curious that both these you could categorize as science fiction or speculative fiction, and I wonder if you see today in speculative fiction or science fiction some possibilities for this sort of inventive critique of the political systems we have around.
Just a moment. I'm going to unshare my screen. It will be better. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can see everyone again. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I do think so. I mean, but maybe not specifically with regard to kind of coming to terms with Stalinism, communism, National Socialism. But of course, what we can see is, I mean, a kind of a fiction that problematizes, I mean, I wouldn't say newer versions of manipulation, but of course, when we talk about fake news or the rise of new movements, political extremist movements, also in Europe, I mean, we can see that we have the same kind of problematization of the position of literature, the arts, and the importance of language, of course. Also in speculative fiction. Kracht's novel was published in 2008, and so I mean it's not very long ago. I mean there's a big time span between Zamyatin and Kracht. So we can see that I mean Kracht is also about coming to terms with communist dictatorship, but I think this is still going on, you know, in speculative fictions, in science fiction, etc.
Okay. Does anyone have any further questions? Well, your discussion reminded me of George Orwell's Newspeak in 1984. Your discussion of Zamyatin's book, actually. They make up this new language for the totalitarian state and totalitarian ideology, totally fabricated, manipulated language in order to deliver fabricated, manipulated. Yeah,
absolutely. Indeed. Yeah. I have a couple of references to Orwell, of course, 1984. But
Newspeak, right?
Yeah, but it's I mean very clear. I mean that there's also a lot of similarities. For example, representations of book burnings, but also the performative act of writing, of writing a journal, for example, a diary. Which is, I mean, because we is written in diary form, and I mean a diary is, of course, I mean the genre of subjective everyday writing, and so we can see in a lot of dystopian novels set in totalitarian states, I mean, that the protagonist keeps a diary, and it is often written in this diary form. And so, indeed, I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, that there's a lot of similarities between 1984 and We. We is really a wonderful novel. I haven't been able, I mean, to show all the different levels of the novel, but it's for me it's 1984 and we are really both wonderful.
Yeah, I as soon as I lay my hands on it, I will read it. Absolutely. It sounds very interesting. Okay, well,
I have something that I want to ask.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sepp, for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. But my question again goes to Dr. DAWES. You know, you talk about genre, and Dr. DAWES also talks about human rights genre, right? You have suggested such a genre. So what kind of criteria actually you are suggesting for having this kind of genre? Do you believe that dystopian novels or kind of, you know, climate fiction novels with disease, viruses, can be, you know, included in human rights novel genres or human rights genre? It is not necessarily, it shouldn't be novels, maybe poetry or other literary works as well.
Is this a question for me or
for Dr. James DAWES? I'm not sure about your surname pronunciation. DAWES.
I think climate fiction, which you mentioned, cli-fi, is a really interesting genre, and I would love to study it more. I feel like that's where the front lines of a lot of the literary battles in science fiction are right now, particularly. Dr. Sepp is probably...
You have talked about human rights genre. You have suggested creating a new genre in literary canon, you know. Do we have such a genre, and what kind of novels can be included in this genre?
Oh, that's a good question, big one. I will take that up with you over dinner when I visit in Istanbul. Oh,
okay then. You know, these days we have got interesting terminology. You know, I just come across, you know, like campus fiction genre, disease narrative genre, so human rights genre. It was quite interesting. I didn't know that we have got such a genre. You have talked about it. Just by having your name, I just searched your area of interest and I come across that suggestion, human rights genre.
Yeah.
I think that my students would be interested in working and reading those novels that are under that genre. Okay, thank you. So if it is a long answer, we would sorry.
Yep. Maybe better to move on to the next presentation by Lejla MULALIĆ. And she's an associate professor of English language and literature. She teaches at the University of Sarajevo. Dr. MULALIĆ's research is about historical novels and the concepts of nation and identity in, for example, contemporary Scottish literature. She is interested in, therefore, literature and history, and she uses a lot of different sources, from fiction, poetry, to historical documents and films, and so she's into studying interdisciplinary things, apparently. She is one of the co-founders of the Peace Education Hub at the Faculty of Philosophy of the same university, the University of Sarajevo. So, and she's going to present us, give us a presentation about Scottish fiction and the working class, representations of working class women in James Cameron's How Late It Was, How Late. So here is Lejla MULALIĆ. Welcome, Dr. MULALIČ.
Thank you very much. Would it be possible to make me co-host so that I can share my presentation?
Okay.
Yes, you are the co-host.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I hope you can see the presentation now. Okay, so thank you very much for introduction. I will tell you a little bit about a Scottish novel by James Kelman, which was published in 1994, with a focus on the representation of working class voice in that novel, and I will connect it to David Morrissey's ideas on human suffering and moral community. Hopefully that will all fit in 15 minutes. I'll give my best. So I'll briefly introduce the author who wrote this very inaccessible and strange novel that surprisingly won the Booker Prize in 1994. He was the first Scottish novelist to win this award. The novel is, well, I say inaccessible because the language in which it's written is actually Scottish, even Glaswegian vernacular. For my students, it took them a lot of time to accept the terms of the author and to actually start understanding and enjoying the novel. But once they accepted his terms, once they allowed him, actually allowed for the fact that he has a voice which is different and distinct, they definitely did enjoy the novel. However, the critical establishment wasn't very happy with this award. The comments were, I quote, "How unreadable it was, how unreadable." And James Kelman was proclaimed an illiterate savage. There was a lot of resistance, especially amongst the English readers, who found it not only inaccessible in terms of language, but also quite obscene, because the F word is actually all over the book for several times on each page. It was obviously sort of a protest on the part of the author, and he clearly had an intention with such an approach. Just a brief look at his own life. He left school at the age of 15. He took an apprenticeship. He worked in night shifts in factories. He was a bus driver in Glasgow. In his late 20s, actually, he took evening classes in creative writing. And he firmly believed that academic establishment, especially English literature departments, were very elitist and somehow closed off to people like him, who were distinctly working class people. When he received his award, to dismay of many people there, but also he had many, many supporters, obviously, he said, I quote, "I see it's an argument based solely on behalf of validity, that my culture and my language have the right to exist, and no one has the authority to dismiss that right. They may have power to dismiss that right, but the authority lies in the power, and I demand the right to resist it." He believed that a lot of literature written in Great Britain was actually middle-class literature that featured characters who never had issues with money, who could therefore not understand the kind of difficulties that the main character of his novel, Sammy Samuels, was going through. And Sammy Samuels, the main character, he wakes up in the beginning of the novel after a heavy drinking over the weekend, and he's beaten and he's apparently blind. He doesn't remember how it happened. And for the rest of the book, he's trying to find his way, literally, his way home, because he can no longer see and he has no one to help him. Interestingly, medical help is not the first thing he asks for, but he wants his disability to be recognized in the administrative offices, because he wants, of course, state benefit, and he wants to find a job as a person with disability. So he's not really looking so much for assistance by medical staff as much as he wants protection and certainty in terms of his position as a worker. When it comes to particular ideas related to this book, I would like to point out the fact that it challenges labels and hierarchies from its very outset. Namely, it is a working class novel, but it defies the standards and narrative expectations of a realist working class novel, because it's written in the stream of consciousness mode for most of the time, which makes it additionally difficult, since it also levels down certain linguistic hierarchies between what we say and what we think. He says that he refuses to translate for middle-class readers, and he really wants to allow this voice of a working class man, and he empowers him as a central consciousness of the novel. His spelling throughout the novel is inconsistent. And in doing so, he challenges the idea that working class man is a sort of homogeneous category, but he actually foregrounds, I quote, the inevitable failure of a normative narrative voice. So there is no certainty whatsoever in the novel, linguistic or political. When it comes to his sense of national identity, it's not the first thing that you feel in the novel, although he identifies as a Scottish author, but you feel his Glaswegian regional identity as something far more dominant in the novel. As I said, the fact that he identifies with his city is very important, because the history of Glasgow is quite ambiguous and somehow not fully related to how we imagine Scotland to be. It's not Highlands, it's not Lowlands, it's not a cultured Edinburgh, it's something quite different. A city that is very layered and both old and new at the same time. It has some of the most interesting layers of Glasgow's history. Would be that it was, for instance, the second city of the empire after London. So it was an imperial center, but it was also a place of social agitation, of rent strikes, and workers' protest in the First World War and afterwards, only to be given the status of the European City of Culture in 1990. So 3 completely different strands, narrative strands in this particular city. And since it was European City of Culture shortly before the publication of this novel, James Calmont, who was definitely very much involved and engaged in this event, he claimed that this cultural event actually suppressed working class history of Glasgow, that it suppressed the less beautiful, the less appealing face of Glasgow, and instead promoted the touristy, the heritage side of it. So his novel was a way of bringing back and rescuing and redeeming that aspect of Glasgow, which was not considered to be very cultured or presentable. The way in which I would like to connect this narrative with David Morris's concept of moral community and social suffering is actually what I saw as a connection between my talk and your conference's topic. David Morris deals with some very interesting ideas, such as moral community, a group of people that clearly empathize with one another, a group of people that would recognize suffering in someone else and recognize it as such. And these boundaries of a moral community are rather flexible. For instance, mostly humans would not allow animals to be part of a moral community. But let's say in American societies, pets would be allowed to be part of that moral community. Or throughout the past, often children, women, let's say, or people of color would be excluded from the moral community. Also, war criminals, or let's say serial killers or serial rapists, but not bank robbers. So there will be people who clearly can belong and people who will be always outside of that community. Now, when it comes to suffering as something that is clearly not given, David Morris says that it is not something you can find outside. It's not something that is easily recognizable, but it's something that either is given an existence or not. It is recognized or given an identity or not, depending on not whether the person suffering belongs to our community. In order to argue his point, he mentions a well-known poem by a British poet, Winston H. Auden, and the poem is called Musée des Beaux-Arts, and it is based on Bruegel's painting about the fall of Icarus. And this is the painting, which is supposed to be about the fall of Icarus, this tragic event when Icarus's wings melt in the sun and he falls into the sea, and there he is. But his tragic destiny is obviously completely unnoticed by all other people in the painting. So you see the peasant here plowing the field, and obviously some people on a ship, but no one seems to really notice and register and recognize his suffering. So it seems that the suffering is in the eye of the moral community rather than as an objectively existing fact. And it's really up to literature to transgress the boundaries of this moral community or any moral community, and to either create or uncreate suffering, or actually to give voice to those who otherwise obviously do not have a voice. This very much reminds me of what history is, because certainly history is not a collection of historical facts. It is a narrative, and it is a representation of facts. Facts in themselves, just like suffering, they don't really have any meaning unless you put them together in a certain narrative, as Hayden White claims. Likewise, we can say the same thing for suffering. Someone's suffering simply cannot touch us or reach us unless it is intelligible or relevant to us. In that sense, I see this novel as really important, because it urges us to, discard our own expectations as readers, our own even prejudices we have as readers, regardless of whether we are native speakers of English or not. It's even, I think, more difficult if you're not a native speaker of English, because you have additional layers of meaning to go through. So in that sense, this novel is definitely a novel which deals with human rights in the most general meaning of that word. And as I said, my students, when I first taught this novel, found it really very, very challenging and somewhat off-putting. It took us at least 2 weeks for them to go through the linguistic barrier and to actually begin to see people in the novel and hear their voices and understand and engage in their narratives. So I found that rather very interesting as a teacher of how it can achieve much more than just me delivering content and they absorbing the content, but actually changing their attitudes towards something they don't necessarily find relatable in the beginning, but eventually understand how much it changes them as persons. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing the screen, and I hope I managed to fit in the time allocated, because I know there are quite a few people who have to present later on.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. MULALIĆ. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. MULALIČ? Any comments? Okay. I turned all pink now. Sorry about this camera.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you that we cannot actually see you. I mean, I can't see you.
I'm not gone anywhere. I'm still here. Don't worry.
We know you are.
All right. Okay, so let me present you then our next speaker, Raluca ANDREESCU, an assistant professor at the University of Bucharest in the Modern Languages Department. She holds an MA in American Studies and a PhD in philology from the same university. Her research interests are American cultural studies, American law, literature, Gothic literature, women's studies. She is the author of a volume about female Gothic in American century, with a focus on the works by Edith Wharton, Shirley Jackson, and Joyce Carol Oates. So here is Dr. ANDREESCU. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'll try to go through my paper as quickly as possible. So my presentation is entitled Like a Feather Falling from the Wing of a Bird, an exploration of climate insecurity and women's reproductive rights in Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, which is a piece of speculative fiction or a dystopia. So we will be back to that topic. Right, so it has been consistently argued that the impact of climate change is not gender neutral, but it affects women in a larger measure, and it renders them particularly vulnerable to insecurity and various forms of violence and abuse. A G20 report at the beginning of the 21st century showed that women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change. The report came out in 2001. Almost a decade later, the American legislature highlighted the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and the efforts of women globally to address climate change, and pushed for the use of gender-sensitive frameworks in developing policies to address climate change with accounts for the specific impacts of climate change on women. The impact and health outcomes are arguably even more dire when it comes to pregnant women. Evidence shows that temperature growth and heat waves increase the likelihood of miscarriage, premature delivery, and stillbirths. The same connection has been documented between negative pregnancy outcomes and high levels of air pollution, coupled with heat exposure. American sociologist Sabrina McCormick observes that while pregnant women have traditionally fallen outside of our conception of who's vulnerable to heat, people need to really change that conception. Ignoring women's disproportionate vulnerability to environmental and health consequences represents an infringement on their political, social, economic, and ultimately reproductive rights. And the violation of women's rights is more stark when catastrophic events transform physical and social worlds. This paper starts from the premise that this is precisely what Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, her novel, which came out in 2017, sets out to explore the fact that when the world is confronted with an environmental and biological catastrophe of epic proportions, women's rights to safety and security, to reproductive self-determination and care, are the first to be violated, especially when the fate of humankind as we know it seems to hang in the balance. Literature plays a pivotal role in the advancement of human rights, as people's reading acts have implications not only for the imagination, but also for the legislation of an international human rights community. The manner in which human rights are portrayed in literary narratives can enable the steadfast pursuit of social justice and ensure their practical realization by appealing to our shared humanity. From this perspective, Valentina Adamy highlights the centrality of feminist speculative fiction alongside legal theory in advancing and sustaining women's reproductive rights. She observed that by zooming in on the status of women's rights in the present, speculative fiction and dystopian narratives put forth projections of what might happen in the future if current trends continue unchallenged, or if, on the contrary, they are challenged and subverted. Along the same line, Sarah Hall maintains that in order for its speculations to be taken seriously, dystopian writing must be part of a discussion of contemporary society, a projection of ongoing political failures, perhaps, or the ringing of present jeopardy for future disaster. Consequently, the oftentimes negative scenarios advanced by feminist speculative fiction mirror existing conditions in the writer's immediate reality, which is mostly dominated by insecurity and anxiety triggered by excessive control over women's bodies or the unchecked deployment of reproductive technologies. Almost 4 decades ago, feminist philosopher Jolie Murphy noted in her article Egg Farming and Women's Future that patriarchy regards women mostly as reproductive bodies who exist for the production of the species and who are constantly discouraged, forbidden to use their bodies for themselves. Sarah Hall doubles down on the subject, claiming that the area of reproductive rights is an absolute minefield, one laid in the female anatomy, and that any interference with fundamental rights of the female body and the female mind is the absolute sign of a failing society or a desperate society. Louise Erdrich's recent novel, Future Home of the Living God, constructs such a failing and desperate society. Seemingly without explanation, the world is confronted with a climatological meltdown that had been brewing for some time, ever since winter became a ghost season, accompanied by the dissolution of the natural world and the biological regression of all things living. For lack of anything else, people are arguably blaming a new kind of virus, maybe bacteria, from the permafrost. Even in the context of dystopian fiction, this is not surprising, given that permafrost thaw has been acknowledged by the UN as one of the 5 most pressing environmental issues of these last few years, which also represents a threat for human security, both regionally and globally. The only certainty is that of biological chaos across the animal world and of things going backward at an awkward rate. Small-celled creatures and plants have been shuffling through random adaptations for months. Ducks are not ducks and chickens are not chickens, insects are nutritious, and there are ladybugs the size of cats. Giant birds of prey have become beakless and featherless and developed reptilian tails evocative of the Archaeopteryx of the Jurassic era. Chicken have turned into pale iguanas, and saber-toothed cat things are lurking in the shadows, preying on pet dogs. On top of everything else, mammalian forms of life are confronted with a massive reproductive crisis, as dogs, cats, horses, pigs, etc. have stopped breeding true. The human species undergoes the same unexplainable crisis of reproduction as the number of stillbirths has increased. Echograms reveal underdeveloped neocortices and male sexual organs which are not forming properly, if at all. Additionally, more and more women die giving birth, martyrs in a world that is climbing back down the swimming pool ladder into the primordial soup, because something terrible, unnatural is taking place, and they are doomed to die in a welter of bloody, agonized hysteria. So in these circumstances of large-scale ecological unraveling, the experience of being pregnant is less one of joy and hopefulness and more one of uncertainty and insecurity. The novel's protagonist, Cedar Hawk songmaker, 26-year-old Ojibwe, adopted and raised by Minneapolis liberals, is on the run in an attempt at safeguarding her pregnancy and keeping her newborn in defiance of a new political order bent on strict control and persecution by state powers and the new religious authority, a church government, the Church of the New Constitution, evocative, of course, of Margaret Atwood's totalitarian Republic of Gilead. Written as a series of diary entries meant for the protagonist's unborn child, the novel documents the way the dissolution of the natural world triggers and is doubled by the steady rolling back of women's rights and by the introduction of regressive reproductive policies. The dystopian narrative portrays the progression of Cedar's pregnancy in parallel with the regression of the environments of living beings and of human and particularly women's rights and liberties. The parallels with a gloomy version of contemporary or historical America are hardly understated, and the architecture of social horrors and state terror is described in an abundance of detail. In a feat removed from reality only by a few degrees, given the latest militarization of law enforcement and US borders, the state has been highly militarized, and military drones, so artful, so small, are patrolling the neighborhoods, forcing people underground. The borders with the neighboring Mexico and Canada had already been sealed years before, as neither of them want us. Yet Canada still functions as the escape hatch in the roof of this country, though the fence is well guarded and people are constantly hunted down and returned in a legislative move suggestive of the Fugitive Slave Act of the pre-Civil War era, as well as, again, Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. As part of an ideology that for women amounts to state terrorism, members of the community have been pitted against one another, encouraged to turn in their pregnant neighbors and family members, or even tortured and forced to confess during truth seminars reminiscent of the Inquisition. These seminars can only be administered by ordained ministers and overseen by the military and conducted according to certain laws. Precedents set by the church a few centuries back have come in handy. As a result of the reproductive crisis, female gravid detention is enforced throughout the country by legislative fiats under the currently notorious post-9/11 Patriot Act, which not only empowers the government to keep track of pregnant women, but also allows for them to be sequestered in medical establishments to deliver their newborn in controlled circumstances. Former prisons have been converted into birthing centers, subsequent to the ostensible mass euthanasia of their lawful occupants. A sign above the entrance says Stillwater Birthing Center, but it is only a painted piece of canvas that covers Minnesota Correctional Facility Stillwater. Pregnant women are forcefully removed from their homes and confined to these centers, but also any woman who's childbearing age, you can get picked up for running a stoplight or jaywalking. Any mistake and you end up here. In defiance, but also in fear of this new world order, young Cedar tries to navigate the novel reality, initially by avoiding capture and eventually by plotting escape. Isolated at home, she ends up terrorized by a mother, which is an obvious reference to the ants in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and the similar enabler of the new totalitarian theocratic regime. This talking head's sole mission is to urge women to have the courage to save the country we love, become a womb volunteer, and gestate embryos taken from in vitro clinics or old sperm banks. Here, the narrative turns into a litany of anxieties and doubts triggered by Cedar's severe isolation and dread at being found. Will this be the day that I am discovered and taken away? And what then? What would they do to you? She is eventually captured and imprisoned to bring her pregnancy to full term under church-state supervision. In gravid detention, the symbol of her resistance becomes an angry ball of yarn, which together with a fellow pregnant detainee, she first unravels from blankets over long stretches of time, then braids into a rope strong enough to allow them to climb out the window and down the prison hospital wall. The old-time finger weaving, an Ojibwe method of creating fancy sashes, wall hangings, belts, stump lines, and ropes, proves symbolically instrumental in facilitating their short-term escape. But the angry ball of yarn above is not just a symbol of Cedar's resistance against regimentation and subjugation. It is the very core metaphor for the activist agenda of the novel itself, which similarly spins a good and angry yarn. Just like Cedar is steadily documenting life on the precipice for a future generation in the form of letters to her unborn child, so is Erdrich's novel advancing this activist idea of resistance through the power of narration. Letter writing, both real and fictional, has often been used as a form of communication in trying circumstances, which endanger those involved in the exchange, as for instance, when contact is forbidden or movement restricted, during times of war or foreign occupation, or when the dialogue between two people represents an overt act of political opposition. Moreover, given its potentially transgressive, counteractive character, especially in times of strife, the circulating written words stands proof against total control and manipulation by the powers that be. As François Lyotard observes, totalitarianism cannot be fully realized until it eliminates the intractable contingency of writing. Cedar's daily documentation of the steady biological and societal deterioration is an act of resistance, against the controlling forces of the new government, which, as the ultimate keepers of knowledge and data storage, have practically seized all communication channels. Moreover, her long and involved missive is a way of preserving her humanity and recording it for future generations against the backdrop of dehumanizing practices and evolutionary uncertainty that might bring about a lightless future devoid of the written word. This testimonial right into the future is ultimately an act of unwavering hope for the world and for her son's survival. Moving on to the conclusions, having put it on hold for many years, Louise Erdrich resumed working on her novel shortly after Trump was elected president, and against the background of the increasing influence of the religious right and Mike Pence's prominence of the conservatively oriented Supreme Courts debating the repeal of Roe v. Wade within a culture ostensibly dominated by sexual violence and in a world threatened by a looming climate and ecological crisis. Arguing that fighting for women's rights is an unrelenting battle and dreading the thought that her daughters might have to live with the steady erosion of human progress, Erdrich constructs a society where a large-scale climate and ecological catastrophe has triggered the steady recession of women's reproductive rights in a desperate attempt at policing the last remnants of potential human life. The novel focuses on the vulnerability of pregnant women in the face of a global environmental disaster and on the precariousness of the human species in general, and it bears an environmentally activist agenda. From this perspective, the epistolary narrative seems intent to confront the reader with the prospective enormity of losses in a world we didn't know it was heaven, in the hope of staving off the ultimate disaster for all things living. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andreescu, for your wonderful presentation. And does anyone have any questions, any comments at this point?
If we have time, yeah, I would.
But just a couple of minutes.
Okay, so I just wonder what type of problem did the women in the novel suffer from? What happened that they are suffering from, you know, is there any fertility problem related to climate change in that novel?
Yes, I think that is implied. So that's the thing, nobody knows what caused all these developments. Nobody knows why animals and women, human beings, have started developing all these issues. And the media cannot be trusted.
And did the protagonist apply to any kind of medical thing that can help her to overcome the reproduction problem?
Medical establishment or
you know,
drugs?
Any kind of, you know, help, medical help to get pregnant?
Well, the problem was that medical establishments, hospitals had become sort of like prisons. So women seeking care were actually imprisoned. That's why they were trying to hide and escape state control. It wasn't safe for them to go and seek medical help, because women who actually, so most of these women did not manage to keep their pregnancy and would die during childbirth. But there were women who managed to give birth, and these women were used and exploited and fertilized against their will to give birth to children. So that was institutional help was out of the question.
Okay, thank you.
Her mother provides help. Her adopted mother provides help, but no, there's no institutional help.
You know, I just ask these questions because, you know, in these types of novel that, you know, take the problem of, you know, reproduction, we have got two approaches. One of them is, you know, the governments actually make the women to resort to the capitalist system to get pregnant. So, you know, the big pharma is the problem here. They are paying a lot. They are going through those expensive methods to get pregnant, but actually the problem is somewhere else. And another thing is that, you know, the government actually, again, because of lack of resources, prevent them from getting pregnant. Again, I just wanted to catch that point that do they have a law that you shouldn't get pregnant? But you told that it is not like that.
No, on the contrary. On the contrary, they encourage pregnancies by any means, but there is a problem with the fetuses, or with taking pregnancies to term. But I can give you an example for your first category, the capitalist exploitation of women's bodies, yes, or pregnancies. Another dystopia, which is recent, it came out 3 or 4 years ago. It's called The Farm, and it points to yes, women, these women living in a resort. It's by Joanne Ramos, The Farm, and it deals with surrogacy issues for the very rich. And we have the bodies of immigrant women being exploited for the very rich elite who, for different reasons, cannot conceive on their own.
Yeah, women turn into a kind of breeding machine.
Hence The Farm. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I will read your novel. Absolutely, it was fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Andreescu. Well, should we move on to our next speaker, Erel MEZ?
I think we have another question.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead, please. Yeah.
No, it's all okay. And thanks for the lovely presentation, Dr. Andreescu. You talked about ecological disasters, oppressive government actions, and the lack of freedom of speech in the novel. My question is there any sign of hope in the book? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. Some of my colleagues would say that there is no hope, and I know this because I've talked with some of my colleagues, but I do see hope in the fact that she does write these letters who are intended for a future reading by her son, who is not born yet. There are different, but besides this, writing to the future, which implies that there is a future, that there still are people, that her son is born and he is able to read his mother's diaries or letters. There are also these moments of hope when she manages to escape. However, they are short-lived because such is the society that people resort to betrayal. So it's more difficult to keep hope in times like this. But I would say that yes, there is some hope, but particularly related to the fact that someone will read. Someone someday will read her, and by someone I mean her son, the future living God, will read this materials documented by his mother. There's not necessarily much hope in dystopias, but in general, but in these recent feminist dystopias, there is resistance and there is hope. But it is a very good question and a very pertinent one. Thank you.
Okay. Can we move on to the next speaker now? Yes. Erel MEZ, he holds a BA degree in English language and literature and an MA degree in American culture and literature. He is working toward his PhD at Ege University, and his research interests lie in Renaissance literature, medieval studies, also short story, and Gothic. Erel MEZ lectured at Gazi, Atılım, Yaşar University, several universities in Turkey, and currently he is a lecturer at the English Language and Literature Department at Topkapı University. So, yes, enjoy his presentation.
Thank you very much, Hocam. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, we do.
Okay, then. I'm going to talk about a short story, actually, which focuses on the immigration issue, which was a point focused on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually. In 1948, the United Nations ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was, of course, a major milestone in human rights advancement. And the UDHR declares equal entitlements to dignity and liberties at birth, yet it is unfortunately unfulfilled in many regions. Especially, refugee treatment varies based on local regulations, causing a gap between ideal and actual standards. And in 2009, the Amnesty International honored the Declaration's 60th anniversary with a commemorative event. They published a collection of short stories, each of them highlighting a particular article of the Declaration. And the author, Arvi SEPP, showcases excellent ability in using personal experiences to express general truths in her contribution to this collection. Her short story, named The Go-Between, in it she pays tribute to Declaration Article 13's freedom of movement and Article 14's right to asylum, with characters forced to leave their homes and seek solace in new territories. Arvi SEPP aims to emphasize that human rights are essential for a free and respectable life. She stresses the need for empathy and an inclusive society without prejudice. And her short story displays our ability to understand and empathize with others, shown through an African character, our protagonist, who is trying to reach Europe despite comedic and challenging situations. Many refugees like him seek a better life due to unfair circumstances. The fundamental principle of human rights is that individuals are protected against violations by the state. This does not mean that, this is important, this does not mean that individuals must behave in an individualistic manner, nor do they all do so in practice. The mobility of both individuals and communities presented a formidable topic in 1948 and currently serves as a paramount matter of interest. The Declaration provides valuable insights for contemplating the subject of migration. Migration is crucial for human rights, and the Declaration ensures rights for everyone, regardless of nationality. Empirical evidence shows that migrants often face obstacles to basic human rights. For instance, they can be admitted to a country for protection, but lose the right to work. However, they have the right to a fair process when dealing with border authorities and legal proceedings in their host country. They should be informed of valid reasons for refusal and not face discrimination based on ethnicity, race, or religion. And this study analyzes how outer factors impact the lives of refugees in the go-between, the short story about an African asylum seeker. And the story revolves around the motive of existence as an African refugee. The protagonist embodies the gap between suppression and autonomy, attempting to cross into Spain as a representation of his position in a complex social and political environment. The story explores denial of human rights and characters' struggle to claim them, risking loss of belonging and entering a state of liminality. It is an ironic commentary on shortcomings in realizing basic human rights despite a 60-year history. And Alice Smith, who is a celebrated contemporary Scottish author, exhibits exemplary traits of a short story writer, including rigid self-control during the introductory stage, a keen ability to compress intricate details, proficiency in utilizing individual experiences to imply universal truths, and skill in alluding to a broader world outside the narrative. Her short story, The Go-Between, centers on a protagonist of African descent who ardently pursues a desirable existence marked by security, prosperity, and freedom from economic instability. And the short story takes its leitmotif from the articles, from the Declaration's Article 13, which exactly states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. In the story, African people try to leave Africa due to poverty, conflict, or famine. The narrator's, the nameless narrator's vocation entails facilitating the cross-border movement of refugees, a role commonly referred to in the story as a border crosser, as a liaison between the refugees and the French doctors. Thereby, he embodies the role of a go-between, as we see in the title of the short story. Although the professional duties associated with this occupation have proven to be quite challenging for him, the persistence he exhibits in continuing to perform the duties despite the grave injuries sustained is indicative of remarkable determination and a positive outlook. The unfortunate incident of the narrator losing half of his ear and one finger en route to Spain serves as an indication of the rigorous measures implemented by Spain to deter refugees. The narrator led his life as a transnational individual devoid of fixed national boundaries. Currently, he provides aid to asylum seekers. Due to his occupation as a border crosser, he has endured a wild and challenging personal history. For example, he has witnessed instances of refugee torture while trying to cross the fences. Their present location presents the opportunity for crossing the border between Europe and Africa, facilitated by Spain's territorial possession of Ceuta, which is a colony situated in northern Morocco in Africa. Ceuta and Melilla, these are two cities, Spanish territories in Africa. They reveal an interaction of socio-political influences from both Spanish and African contexts. Following the decline of Islamic conquest in Spain, the Spanish reconquered the peninsula and expanded their territorial claims to include Ceuta and Melilla in the 16th century. In 1986, those cities were incorporated into the European Union alongside Spain. Within that context, they set up an indivisible constituent of Spain and consequently form an inseparable part of the EU. The cities serve as the sole land border separating Europe from an African country. But in 2005, Spain built a 20-foot barrier around Ceuta and Melilla to stop smuggling and migrants entering the EU. 2 parallel 6-meter fences with barbed wire. Both cities, being unique entry points for Africans into Europe, are significant for EU migration policies and have become examples of how the external borders of the EU are conceptualized. Morocco objected as it did not recognize Spain in Ceuta. Moreover, the fence led to more migrants crossing urban jurisdictions. In that year, around 9,000 people migrated across the borders. Migrants swam across the border, which caused Spanish government unease. The military were sent to handle the crisis and used physical force to prevent migrants from entering Spanish cities. Opposition to the response to the crisis in those cities was significant from NGOs who stated that it violated EU legislation and legal protocols, cautioning Spain on violence against migrants during the ongoing crisis. They advised Spain to create secure and lawful methods for shielding migrants in need. And Isabel Bracero from American Red Cross aided tired migrants in Ceuta and expressed surprise at the situation. And after military intervention, Ceuta residents showed collective support for migrants by attending the funeral of a teen who died trying to reach Ceuta by sea. And in the middle of Spanish and Moroccan violence, many refugees died and many were injured. Choosing the right narrator in the short story and point of view is key to conveying Alice Smith's message. An example can be seen in the sentence, "I was telling you about the fences." The narrator asks direct questions to engage the reader in interpreting their inquiry and to focus on refugees. Simple writing style creates intense emotion. And it is like a stream of consciousness narrating technique. And so the organization of the story is haphazard. So the narrator shifts between distinct situations and narratives. And the text sustains readers' engagement with short sentences and the witty narrator using self-referential humor. The border crosser extraordinaire, or Professor Me, had the unique ability to cross international borders, offering insight into the lives of many living in Africa who face a facility disparity compared to most of Europe. Due to unemployment and poverty, their lives are often unremarkable with limited opportunities for engagement. And he is skilled in many languages from his academic studies. He speaks well and helps people with his knowledge. He's proud of his achievements, probably as a result of the insufficient assistance he has received. But he currently experiences a psychological split within his character, with a sense of uncertainty with regards to his future prospects, specifically in terms of determining a proper residential location and a career path. Part of his desire is to relocate to Spain. The author vividly recounts a nighttime experience wherein the narrator envisioned himself strolling along the grand avenues of Madrid, featuring splendid and imposing structures of perfect whiteness. The potential relocation from his dwelling in Africa would result in a substantial loss to him. The act of fleeing from one's life and the African continent institutes a loss of large portions of one's selfhood and overall personality. And he is not afflicted with the phenomenon commonly referred to as Spanish blindness, a term that characterizes many refugees who hold an outlook limited only to their prospects in Europe. They display a strong level of fortitude to transcend the fence and gain entry onto stable European territory, revealing a willingness to undertake any necessary measure to achieve this goal. The narrator does not manifest symptoms associated with it, his utmost desire being providing assistance to individuals in pursuit of their aspirations. He undertakes such action due to familiarity with the fact that individuals do not abandon their homes or dwelling places unless compelled to do so. He was compelled to vacate his residence in Cameroon and presently provides support to refugees, a kind of aid he himself did not get when forced to leave. And he shows a sense of dignity, he displays a sense of pride, but experiences feelings of shame regarding his disabilities. This observation can be exemplified by the presence of physical characteristics such as his noticeable limp, the incompleteness of his ear, and the absence of one of his fingers, which he mentions consistently in the story. And the sense of belonging at this point carries significant importance, particularly in light of the various identifiers and categories that we utilize to classify ourselves and our peers. Individuals belong to a diverse range of social bodies, and the organization of our lives revolves around the sense of affiliation towards various entities. The sense of belonging to a particular geography is said to stem from social interactions within that place, which may encompass both informational exchange as well as communal, socially recognized indicators. The centrality of a sense of belonging to the preservation of both physical and mental health cannot be overstated. The relational connections that are associated with a perception of being part of a social group possess a strong function in assisting with the regulation of stress and several other behavioral concerns. Aspiration towards a more prosperous existence is deemed admirable. However, excessively elevated expectations may bear negative repercussions upon confronting verisimilitude. Instances of dismemberment, repeated efforts to flee, and aggressive altercations. All of these factors fail to exhibit an appealing nature. The narrator currently leads a lifestyle that oscillates between two diametrically divergent spheres, Europe and Africa. He is currently experiencing a state of physical displacement as he finds himself situated in neither of the two continents with which he is associated. The title of the story, The Go-Between, highlights his inability to achieve a definitive resolution as he is permanently confined to a transitional or intermediary position, no matter his actions. And to conclude, first, the current situation. In 1948, the Second World War, when the declaration was ratified, the war was still in the collective consciousness, and the Cold War dominated the second half of the century. But our era sees a notable change in global interdependence with globalization, dominating various areas such as economics, politics, culture, communication, and technology. International organizations, including those linked to the UN, now have greater impact on global affairs since 1948, with a rising awareness about climate change, along with new economic and social patterns. Armed conflicts involve non-state actors, and fighting terrorism continues. New conflicts require new international obligations, like responsibility to protect. After 70 years, now we are able to re-examine the UDHR within our more connected world and reduced ethical disparity. To conclude, the short story, The Go-Between, constitutes an enthralling narrative centered around an African refugee who chronicles his dreary and grievous experiences living in Morocco, while simultaneously detailing his unsuccessful trials and tribulations in his pursuit of escape. Alicemet's intent with this story is to bring to the fore the paradoxical circumstance wherein we commemorate an event that has yet to attain the status of meriting celebration. The story serves as an ironic commentary on the deficiencies in the implementation of human rights, despite their introduction 60 years prior, and the author conveys her perspective of the failure of certain nations to uphold basic human rights in her work. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Erel. Does anyone have any questions for Erel?
Yes, I have a question. Yeah.
Okay, so, but listen, we have exceeded our scheduled time, so can we just limit our questions to just a couple of minutes, and we need to have a break? Okay, great.
What do you think about the problem of citizenship, and what do you think, what is the relationship between the citizenship and human rights? I see that in your short story and many similar novels, you know, the problem of refugees, you know, it seems that because you are born in a certain country, you are deprived of certain rights. What do you think about it?
First of all, the citizenship comes in the second plan in this issue. First of all, the right to live, to protect their lives, and to flee from economic instabilities, to flee from wars, to flee from famine and such kind of great troubles is the first issue according to the Universal Declaration. And this short story actually focuses on that. Citizenship comes in the second plan, and it is also open to discussion, but it is a large issue to talk about, I think.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Yes.
Yes, right. Okay, now can we have a break? Our scheduled break was 20 minutes, but we have exceeded our time. We were gonna start at 8 o'clock, but it seems we have. If you agree, we can start at 10 past 8. How about that? So okay, let's get back here at 10 past 8 p.m. All right.
Thank you.
All right. No problem.
Hi, Fermâ.
Hello.
Hi, just really quick before everyone gets in here. Do you mind if I try on my PowerPoint?
Sure, you go ahead.
Okay, just to make sure that it's gonna run smoothly.
I think it would, yeah, sure.
Oh, it looks like I cannot share my screen.
Well, Sarai will enable, she can enable you to share your screen, I think.
Yes, just
once she joins us.
Yeah. I think you can share it right now.
Yes.
Okay.
Awesome.
So, is it your turn now?
No, ma'am. I was just wanting to make sure that, you know, I'm not gonna delay people. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Yes, I think the break is over. It's 8:10.
No.
Hello, I am back. Hello. Sarai?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can we start?
Yes, sure. If everyone is ready.
Okay. We have Dr. Yakut AKBAY.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Let me give some background information about Dr. AKBAY. She is a faculty member at Ankara Science University. She teaches English translation and interpreting. Dr. AKBAY received her BA and MA degrees from Azerbaijan University and in philology and linguistics. And her PhD degree is at Atılım University, the Department of English Language and Literature. And her areas of interest are post-colonial studies, gender studies, popular culture, and contemporary drama. Thank you very much, Dr. AKBAY. Your turn.
Thank you for your presentation. I mean, for presenting me, and thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing the conference, which in fact covers contemporary issues, not only in literature, but also in our world in general. So one of those contemporary issues is women's issues. In fact, that is what I'm going to talk about today. And I'd like Sarai to authorize me so that I can start
yes, sharing. I have authorized you, Dr. AKBAY.
Okay. All right. Can you see this? Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the name of my presentation is A Search for Identity, the Subaltern in Buche Mecheta's The Slave Girl. Just shortly, I'll go through the abstract so that you have a general idea about what I'm going to talk about today. My criticism is, of course, based on post-colonial criticism, post-colonial feminist criticism. And for this, I am studying Buche Mecheta's The Slave Girl, based on this novel. I adopted Gayatri Spivak's concept of the subaltern in relation to the Nigerian female subject. And I will also shortly talk about this concept as well, and I will introduce Spivak's ideas on the subaltern. So Buche Mecheta's novel, The Slave Girl, which was published in 1977, is a powerful and poignant story that explores issues of race, gender, and class in pre-colonial Nigeria. Set in the late 19th century, the novel tells the story of a young girl named Ogbanja Ojebeta, who is sold into slavery by her own brother after the death of her father. Through the female protagonist, Ojebeta, Mecheta depicts the harsh reality of slavery in Africa and shows how the slave trade not only destroyed families, but also perpetuated a system of oppression and exploitation. Ojebeta is forced into a life of servitude and abuse, having to work long hours in the fields and endure the sexual advances of her male masters. Despite the brutality of her circumstances, Ojebeta remains resilient and determined to survive. She finds comfort in her friendships with other slaves, especially her best friend, the strong-willed and rebellious Obele. Together, the two girls dream of a better life, free from the constraints of slavery. Emecheta also explores the role of women in traditional African society through the character of Ojebeta. The authors show how the main female character is expected to conform to traditional African society and those strict gender roles of her society which dictate that women should be submissive and obedient to men. However, she defies these expectations and asserts her own agency by refusing to accept the injustices of her situation. Throughout the novel, Emecheta also draws attention to the ways in which race and class intersect and create hierarchies of power and privilege. Ojebeta's experience as a slave is shaped not only by her gender, but also by her low social status as a member of the Igbo people. Her masters are predominantly of Yoruba descent, and they use their racial and cultural superiority to justify their mistreatment of Ojebeta and other Igbo slaves. Despite the bleak situation Ojebeta finds herself in, the slave girl ultimately conveys a message of hope and resilience. Her determination to survive and her refusal to resign herself to fate is inspiring, and her friendship with other slaves show the importance of solidarity and community in the face of oppression. The Slave Girl is a powerful and thought-provoking novel that shed light on a dark chapter in African history. Emecheta's vivid portrayal of Ojebeta's struggle against slavery, gender inequality, and racism is a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. This study adopts Gayatri Spivak's concept of the subaltern, which she introduced in her influential essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? The scholar argues that the subaltern, it is the oppressed and marginalized groups in society, are often silenced and ignored by the dominant discourses of power. She argues that the subalterns are unable to speak for themselves in these discourses because they are always already constructed and represented by the dominant power structures. Spivak's work on the subaltern has significantly influenced post-colonial studies and feminist theory. Her ideas have helped draw attention to the importance of listening to the voices of marginalized communities and recognizing how dominant discourses can silence and suppress these voices. She points out that in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak. And the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. The author argues that the question of woman seems to be more problematic, claiming that if you are poor, Black, and female, you get it in three ways. Therefore, Spivak develops a gendered analysis of the subaltern by examining the situation of Indian women in their representation in Western discourses. Spivak's work on the subaltern has been instrumental in understanding the complex dynamics of power and oppression in Nigerian society, especially towards women. Since both Indian and Nigerian societies are patriarchal, it is possible to adopt the concept of the subaltern as a female subject to examine the position of women in the Nigerian cultural context. The present paper aims to defamiliarize Spivak's pessimistic approach to the situation of the female subaltern in relation to Nigerian women. The significance of this study then is to demonstrate the empowerment of Nigerian women vis-à-vis the gender roles prescribed by the patriarchal society. In this regard, African feminism serves as a relevant critical approach to examine the situation of the Nigerian subaltern woman in relation to gendered issues. African feminism, also known as African womanism, emphasizes various aspects of womanhood. Ogunyemi explains womanism in the African context as follows. Womanism is a Black outgrowth from feminism. Womanism is Black-centered. It is accommodationist. It believes in the freedom and independence of women like feminism. Unlike radical feminism, it wants meaningful union between Black women and Black men and Black children, and will see to it that men begin to change from their sexual stand. This popular discourse also serves as a counter-discourse to the negative image of women presented in works written by male authors. Nevertheless, the term feminism has a negative connotation in African society. Laughlin explains that many African women writers disdain the term feminist, which has come to be narrowly defined as a Western idea of strict gender equality or even a synonym for an anti-male stance. The author implies that Western feminism is un-African and irrelevant to African society in general. Similar to the above view, Kolawole points to the fact that African women's cultural difference or otherness has not only been manipulated by patriarchal structures, but also by Western feminists who locate them in marginal or liminal society positions, social positions. To this end, African feminism embodies a set of values that reconstructs a more accurate, a more valid, and a more authentic, wholesome African feminine consciousness and actions. And at this point, it is also worthwhile to mention the role of African women writers in helping to change prevailing views and prejudices about women through their writings. And most women writers feel that their voices in literature are generally drowned under the repressive influence of their male counterparts who have been brought up to take women for granted. And the contribution of Nigerian women writers to the development of African literature is also undeniable. So The Slave Girl in Emecheta is Emecheta's first historical novel. Emecheta uses a traditional African storyteller as the narrator of the novel, providing background information on the social organization of the fictional place called Ibuza up to the early 20th century, when the female character Ojebeta's story begins. The novel is based on the once widespread practice of Igbo domestic servitude. After the death of Ojebeta's parents, Okoli, as an elder brother who is responsible for the welfare of his 7-year-old sister, decides to sell her into slavery to wealthy relatives, the Palakada family, who will raise her as their servant. Okoli tries to ease his guilty conscience by reminding himself that the new white men are trying hard to abolish that type of trade. On the other hand, he recollects how in his childhood, many young women had been kidnapped in the middle of the night when they went out to their toilet. He could still remember his grandfather coming home with strings of captives after raiding neighboring villages. Some of the captives, the lucky ones, were kept as house slaves, but most of them were sold to other people, and those were the times when the human market was at its height. Slavery has existed in various forms throughout the history of Nigeria. The traditional slave trade in Nigeria preceded the arrival of European influence and continued locally long after slavery was actually abolished in many other countries. With the arrival of transatlantic slave trade, traditional slave traders in Nigeria became suppliers of slaves to European slave traders. And although local slavery was officially banned by the British colonial administration in the mid-1880s, it was tacitly allowed to continue until the 1930s and only ended completely in the 1940s. And the reason why the British authorities turned a blind eye to the continuation of slavery was obviously that they themselves profited from this trade. In The Slave Girl, Buchi Emecheta refutes Okoli's motives for leaving his younger sister. Okoli represents a typical display of inhumanity who unashamedly justifies his decision to sell his relative for a few pieces of silver, clearly showing the need to end the oppression of women. Okoli was busy speculating about how much he was going to ask this relative, now very distant, to pay for Ogbanjo Ojebeta. He had never sold anyone before, and now he persuaded himself that what he was about to do was not selling in its actual sense. He was giving his sister away into the keeping of this rich lady and getting some money for her so that when she grew up, she might be given to a suitable husband and could collect the bride price. The author describes the social history of Nigeria from the perspective of a woman writer when she tries the question of freedom in marriage in a society where slavery, which relegated women to the subaltern position and treated them as commodities, had to be abolished. In this regard, forced marriages worsened the situation of Nigerian women by perpetuating their subaltern position as the status quo. Emecheta looks at relations between men and women as a whole and shows how women in pre-independent Nigeria often acted to gain respect and security in their communities. When Ojebeta finally achieves her long-held dream of freedom from Palagadas to return to her ancestral village, she discovers enslavement there. At this moment, Ojebeta, the only educated girl in the town of Ibuza, is to marry her uncle-in-law's cousin, an ignorant peasant whom she despises. Eze agrees to this union, insisting that Ojebeta's education will not be wasted on a stranger since his cousin will pay the bride price. The bride price is still practiced in rural areas of Nigeria. According to this custom, the groom must give some sum of money to other or other valuables to the bride's family. Buchi Emecheta leads the fight for women's rights. She denounces the inhumanity of African men towards women. Thus, the male characters largely appear as the main culprits, demonstrating their apathy towards humanity by exploiting and enslaving women. The men in Ojebeta's life, her brother Okoli, who sells her into slavery, Papa Lagada, who overworks her, and her aunt Yute's husband Eze, who wants to marry her off to his cousin for selfish reasons, they all seek to dominate her. The author illustrates in a very convincing way that women are victims on many levels, which puts them in the position of female subalterns in their own society. Indeed, women formed the majority of enslaved people in Nigeria in the 19th and 20th centuries. And therefore, gender played a significant role in slavery and was at the center of emancipation. In most African societies, which were by nature strongly patriarchal, the emancipation of women was unacceptable. Therefore, in many regions, it was difficult for Europeans to distinguish between marriage and slavery. Another excerpt from the novel, one of the most vivid examples of internalization of women's position as subalterns is described in the episode in which Ojebeta as a child sees her aunt washing away some of her mother's utensils after her mother's death. When Ojebeta asks why she is washing them, her aunt replies that they are to be buried with her mother as she will need them to cook for her father in the land of the dead. And this episode clearly shows the cultural constraints that dictate women to be docile servants to their husbands even after death. At the end of the novel, Ojebeta accepts the marriage proposal of Jacob Okonje, a man who has lived in Lagos for several years and works in one of the city's growing European industries. Emecheta shows that Ojebeta's marriage to a man other than Jacob would have been nothing short of slavery because of the lack of mutual love and respect. This approach is at the heart of African womanism, which is characterized by appreciation, emancipation, elevation, and total self-fulfillment of the woman in positive ways. African womanism aptly expresses the realities and experiences of Nigerian women and promotes complementarity between men and women in Africa. In that vein, Ojebeta's determination is expressed in her free will with which she refuses to marry a man she does not love. Instead, she enters into a marriage with a man of her choice, thus freeing herself not only from slavery, but also from the condition of a submissive subaltern. In her 30s, and still a slave, but this time with a new master, she kneels before the husband of her choice. Thank you, my new owner. Now I am free in your house. I could not wish for a better master. Ojebeta giggled like a young girl of 15. For had she not been rightly valued? Would her mother Umeyadi have wished another life for her daughter? was the glory of a woman, not a man, as the Ibuza people said. So as Britain was emerging from war once more victorious and claiming to have stopped the slavery which she had helped to spread in all her Black colonies, Ojebeta, now a woman of 35, was changing masters. And in conclusion, I don't want to read this conclusion, you just quickly go through it. I decided to conclude it this way, shortly, but there is still a way to go in this paper. So I try to stick to the scheduled time. Thank you for listening to me.
Yes, great. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Dr. Akbay, do you have any questions or comments? Does anyone have any question for Dr. Akbay? If not, we can move on to our next speaker, Dr. Elvan MEZ. Yes, Dr. Elvan MEZ teaches English language and literature at Topkapı University. She has completed her PhD at Ege University. She holds her BA and MA from Ege University. And her research interests lie in the drama, Elizabethan drama, post-war drama, and also postmodern literature. So here is Dr. MEZ, and enjoy.
Thank you, Hocam. I think you can see the presentation now.
Yes, we can.
Okay. My title is Violation of Human and Women Rights and Resistance in Lucy Kirkwood's It Felt Empty When the Heart Went at First, But It Is All Right Now. Okay. Lucy Kirkwood is one of the prominent and triumphant playwrights of English theater, with many awards for her plays, explores crucial issues of our time, such as the gruesome influences of war, the utilization of nuclear power, and its probable threat on human beings. In our play, written in 2009, Kirkwood analyzes the condition of women migrating to England from various developing or underdeveloped countries, but finding themselves in the middle of the sex industry, despite having dreamt about better living circumstances and a promising future. Sorry, I think you cannot see the screen. I'm trying again. Oh.
Yeah, okay, we see.
Yes, I am continuing. Trapping women in sex traffic is a violation of human and women rights by commodifying their bodies and captivating them. However, our protagonist Diana, losing her heart after losing her baby and her lover, does not yield to this violation. Although her rights as a human and woman and her body are abused, she does not turn into a victim by means of her resistance. This study aims to explore the abuse of Diana's human and woman rights by her ex-lover, making her a part of the sex trade and her opposition in mind and memory, as well as her struggle to escape from this vicious circle. Let's look at the human and woman rights around the world. After the end of the Second World War and a severe trauma resulting from physical and psychological agonies, along with tortures and the Holocaust, a study on the human rights commenced after the foundation of the United Nations. The international community of the United Nations aims to assure that the unspeakable atrocities of the world had just witnessed would never be endured again. The declaration is the outcome of the study announced in 1948 so as to guarantee to protect the rights of human beings throughout the world. As Global Citizenship Commission points out, today the declaration, the Universal Declaration, translated into 350 languages, is the best known and most often cited human rights document on earth by setting out for the first time fundamental rights to be universally protected. It is a milestone in the history of human interactions. It is undeniable that every human being, regardless of his or her gender, religion, or ethnicity, has some human rights, such as the right to have a shelter, to stay in, to communicate, or to live independently. Nevertheless, the changing dynamics of the world, including the political, economical, and social features of each country, as well as globalization, influencing these dynamics to a great extent, bring about a slippery atmosphere in which not the practice of human rights, but inequality, violence, sexual harassment, and a number of ways of abuses tend to occur anytime. Women's rights are also the human rights, which are constantly violated somewhere around the world, despite the global political consensus. From the developing and underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, or the developed ones, the rights of women are violated in a variety of ways, such as physical and psychological violence to sexual harassment and rape. Hence, the situation in terms of the violation of human and women rights is alarming around the world. And we also know that there is also the cooperation of the capitalist economic system to the patriarchal system, which prepares the basis of the violation of human rights. And under the dominance of the patriarchal capitalist system, women have a lot of troubles to survive and stand alone, as either they do not have the right of education and earning their lives to have an independent life, or they cannot use their rights because of the oppression of their families or surroundings. In this sense, women mostly have to endure different kinds of violence and abuse without the protection of the state, despite the existence of the declaration. And what is more, the economic circumstances of the countries generally deteriorate women's lives, as they are the group that is influenced by any kind of negativity in the first place. So they either have to suffer at home or have to migrate to developed countries with the hope of a better life and future. However, unfortunately, there is no guarantee of safety, well-being, or happiness for women in any country of the world, where their rights are fully practiced to provide them a safe and sound life. So they are exposed to bear various ways of violation of their rights everywhere. And in the country where they imagine having a good job with a good salary, a happy marriage, and a hopeful future for both themselves and their family, they face one of the most serious violations of human rights, such as slavery and slavery-like practices, like forced sex work, including exchanging a woman for payment, and human trafficking. It is the violation of civil and political rights, which is also called first generation or physical integrity rights. Okay, let's continue. Now we are going to look at the violation of human and women rights in the play. In our play, our protagonist, Diana, is a young woman whose rights are violated in a number of ways, and she attempts to take her independence and life back. She is compelled to prostitution in London, and throughout the play, the reader witnesses her struggle as well as her story, including not only the reason of her migration to England, but also her transformation from a lover to a prostitute and losing everything in her life along with her human and women rights. Migration to a European country in the dreams of millions of people is the beginning of a fantastic and prosperous life with a satisfying job, good money, and a glorious future. The reader learns in the last part that Diana has also migrated to England with the same aim, whereas she supposes that this is the first day of her new life, full of hope and happiness. She is not aware that it is the beginning of a time no woman would like to experience. And on the night of her arrival in London, her cousin Goran introduces her to the friends, and at a bar, she falls in love with a man called Babak, Goran's friend. And she certainly does not know, she certainly would not know Goran and Babak's plan for her while she is dancing at the bar. And in a week, she moves to a flat with Babak since their affair has already started. And while she supposes that Babak also loves her, she also gets pregnant. And moreover, she helps Babak in his job, answers the phone, makes an appointment list for the clients. Nevertheless, she dreams of having a better job after the birth of her daughter. For example, she says, when you are born, I get a new job. Babak can get someone new to do the phones. I work in an office maybe, or be an actress. And by this dream, Kirkwood also reveals her hopes for a good job and a happy marriage with a lovely husband and a daughter. However, nothing happens as she expects, and she realizes the plan waiting for her too late to save herself from Babak's trap under the guise of love. She just assumes that Babak is preparing a holiday for them and needs her passport, so she never gets suspicious of his intentions and gives her passport to him. And although her life changes step by step after she moves to the flat, she cannot realize it. And throughout the last part, the reader can understand that she is not well and she has a problem with the baby, but she cannot understand it as she is very enthusiastic about this baby. And we have the same condition about Babak. She also cannot understand his aims. And there is a phone call with a woman working for Babak. In this phone call, we can understand that this woman was betrayed by Babak again. She came to England for Babak to work with her, but it is only a part of human trafficking. And in Weitzer's words, the difference between pimps who terrorize women on the street and pimps in business suites who terrorize women in gentlemen's clubs is a difference in class only, not a difference in woman hating. So both women find themselves in the sex industry a short time after they migrate to England, and their body is commodified by Babak, even though it is the violation of human and woman rights according to the declaration. And again, at the end of the last part, Diana has a serious health problem. We can understand that she is losing her baby, but she finds that she is locked inside. So after that, she is compelled to be a prostitute by Babak. And as Rebecca surtees, the recruiters of these prostitutes are mostly their friends, acquaintances, family members, or even boyfriends, fiancés, and husbands. And it is the same condition here. And in this play, there is also a criticism against English government. Although it is a European country, first, it cannot prevent this human trafficking and sex traffic. And in the jail, the police officers are not tolerable for her. So she is disappointed as she is fined that she is against the UK laws. So we have a clear violation of human rights here, even in England. What's more, after Diana escapes from Babak, who has forced her and other women to prostitution, she is arrested by the police. So she is in the jail because of her, because of her not having her passport with her. So she is kept in the jail for 96 days. And let's continue. And there are other women in the jail. There are also other women who are abused like her, who are also prostitutes. For example, the other character of the play, Gloria, is also a prostitute, and we can understand her mental problems. She even attacks Diana, and she is also brought by an auntie to England. So there is the human trafficking again for her. And we can also see Diana's bruises on her back, and we can understand the physical and psychological effects of sex traffic on these women. Now let me talk about resistance of Diana. It is the most important feature of the play because she doesn't become the victim of this condition she is in which she is interrupted, and she just resists. And her sentence, she mentions a girl who has had a heart transplantation, and she says to the journalist that it felt empty when the heart went at first, but it is all right now. So in fact, she is in the same condition. She has lost her baby, lost her lover, so she has lost her heart, but she resists this condition. Let me summarize the rest. In the first part of the play, we see that she just counts down her money. She just, counts down the days she is spending as a prostitute, because Bobek tells her that she has to save £20,000. So she just keeps account of her money to get rid of this violation. And it is clear that she is glad with seeing the end of this process. She is looking forward to. She also feels that she is worthy. So this feeling also makes her stronger. For example, she says, "This is extra funny because I know exactly how much I am worth." How many people can say this? I am worth 1,000 euros because that is how much Babek pay for me. To put this in easy language, that is like 2.5 iPhones. It is very sad to hear that, but she doesn't victimize herself. So she is a strong woman, we can see. Okay, let me come to conclusion. I don't want to take your time. In short, in this play, there is a critique of the violation of human and women rights by trapping particularly migrant women in sex traffic, commodifying and exploiting their bodies and abusing them. In spite of her horrible experiences and disappointment, our protagonist Diana achieves resisting the violation of her rights and escaping from this vicious cycle in the end. And her narrative, her feeling worthy, make her resistant. She does not surrender to this system, in fact. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Karaman MEZ. Does anyone have any questions? Any comments for Dr. Karaman MEZ? Okay, if not, then we can move on to our next speakers. Okay, all right, a comment from Professor DAWES. Yes. Well, next speaker is Irene Martí GIL. She received her bachelor's degree in archaeology from the University of Autónoma in Barcelona, and she was an exchange student at the University of Sorbonne in Paris for a while, and then she also holds a degree in from the University of Francisco de Vitoria in Madrid. She earned her master's degree in cultural heritage from the University College London. She is now a PhD candidate at the Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, and her PhD is in geography and anthropology. Her field of research is archaeological looting and smuggling of antiquities. So yes, here is Irene Martí GIL.
Well, thank you so much for this very complete introduction. Actually, I'm very excited because I just graduated from my PhD. So this is the first time that I get to give a conference as a doctor, and I'm so excited. But let's go.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Let's go to the presentation. I don't want to steal any time from anybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organization for putting together such an amazing conference, so enlightening and so really interesting. I've been learning a lot, and hopefully, well, this is a very different scenario that I'm presenting here, but so hopefully I can, you know, help y'all understand what I've been doing these years. Well, that said, I'm going to talk about the critical discourse analysis that I've applied on the heritage laws of Guatemala. This is part of my PhD dissertation that aims at reviewing the laws of the country that are used to protect the cultural heritage of Guatemala, with the intention of identifying what areas of protection can be improved in order to stop or minimize the illegal antiquities trafficking in the country. So that said, I think it's very important to understand here that when I was doing this research, and that's how it links to the topic of this conference, I've realized that one of the main problems in the heritage laws of the country is the systematization of the human rights violations. Guatemala, as you'll probably know, it went through a very deadly civil war from 1960 to 1996 that led to the genocide of mostly Maya people. Over 2,100 people were killed. Over 40,000 people disappeared, and 50,000 people were forcibly removed from their lands. Countless women and children were tortured and raped during those years. And Guatemala somehow it's still healing, and it's in the process of healing after such a duress and distress throughout those 36 years, right? So that said, in order to analyze these cultural heritage laws that the country actually established throughout the war period, I have developed a 3-step discourse analysis that is mostly based on linguistic analysis, critical discourse analysis, and conceptual analysis. And that the way I've interwoven those 3 methods has allowed me to look into the laws at 3 different levels. So at the linguistic level per se, the words and how they shape the sentences, then the critical discourse analysis to see the message behind those supposedly neutral statements, right? And finally, the conceptual analysis to dig into very specific and contentious words, terms, or expressions that are full of meaning, actually. So that's what I've been using to actually draw my conclusions. And these are right here. These are the documents that I have analyzed for the purpose of this dissertation. Well, the results obtained from applying this methodology on the cultural heritage laws of Guatemala indicate that the national heritage is very strictly regulated through a biased authorized heritage discourse. This heritage discourse is the official narrative that is wielded by the state to constitute, present, and control the heritage of the country. And it's specifically designed to meet nationalist political agendas. This narrative is actually based on a Western approach to the ontology of heritage, meaning what the nature of heritage is, as well as the deontology of the heritage laws, the value system that is governing the justice system run by the state, which is already very indicative of what's happening here, right? So these already show us that the heritage laws have not been based on the specificities of the country of Guatemala, but rather it has been inspired, may I say, by Western countries. So this mirroring of the Western world is not an isolated exception. It actually happens really often, and we'll discuss it right here. This authorized heritage discourse that is imposed by the state do present several weaknesses that make it unfit for the wholesome recognition of the heritage of Guatemala. This authorized heritage discourse, first of all, defines heritage in very materialist, essentialist, and dualistic terms that create a very stiff and rigid construct of what heritage is. And actually in Guatemala specifically, and because of its very rich background, cultural background, meaning the cultural heritage of Guatemala is filled with multivocality, fluidity, subjectivity, and none of that is represented in the way heritage is conceived linguistically in those heritage laws. And that carries consequences, obviously. Mainly what it does, it prevents the appreciation of any heritage practices that happen outside those pre-formed categories that are detailed in those laws. All those unauthorized, and I'm using quotations a lot because it's a very sensitive topic, and those are notions that I apply on those terms. So these unauthorized practices and relationships that people create with and around heritage assets are not only left unprotected, legally speaking, because they are not included in that definition of what heritage is according to the laws of Guatemala, but they are criminalized. And the punishments for performing this kind of heritage expressions and practices range from thousands of quetzals, the currency of Guatemala, to time in jail. So it's serious. It is serious. Furthermore, to manage the national heritage construct in Guatemala, what the laws do is to establish a curatorial system based on institutional scientism and conservationism. So institutional scientism is this notion that I've coined, but I think it really helps describing what is happening there. So what I mean by institutional scientism is that only the government and its associated institutions and organizations have the necessary knowledge and means to understand, manage, and protect heritage, or that's how they portray that, okay? if we analyze the laws. These in turns make the state the only representative and the proxy for the Guatemalan culture and the historical heritage, and it shuns descendant communities from any decision-making and from any representation. This institutional scientism, therefore, it creates this dichotomous opposition between the experts, that they have the power to do anything, and the others, the all-encompassing group of neglected and rejected local communities. And of course, the dismissal of heritage producers, holders, and participants, and the relationship with the heritage assets in the lawmaking process creates unequal relationships of power and restrict the human right to access and enjoy heritage. On the other hand, conservationism pursues heritage preservation by crystallizing the cultural significance of the heritage asset in question in time, and it intends to paralyze any natural or anthropogenic, especially unauthorized anthropogenic transformations. The consequences are heritage dehumanization and heritage mummification, as well as that emotional and physical detachment of society from their own heritage. And actually, this falls a little bit out of the field of this conversation, but actually I argue that this is one of the reasons why the legal market in antiquities in Guatemala is still skyrocketing, because what the state is doing is just preserving the monuments as they wish to be seen for tourism purposes, while rejecting the connection that they have with the local populations. And of course, well, there are consequences to that, right? And this is specifically the case of the Arca de Santa Catalina. That's the one represented here in the picture. It's one of the most popular landmarks in Antigua Guatemala, and it's part of the UNESCO World Heritage List as well. And here the situation, it's very dramatic. It's very easy to distinguish. The state has established this set of top-down public regulations to determine how to run the visual of the street, meaning what they want to do is to freeze this monument in time and recreate the specific moment of the Antigua Guatemala history to conform to tourism expectations. However, this official, although an untouchable state discourse fails to include the local vibrancy of the site. Arco has always been a neuralgic center of connection, where residents and property owners, vendors, artists, and performers engage each other socially, economically, and politically in very alternative and contested ways. Unfortunately, when we try to mummify this heritage in time, the value of these interactions of stakeholders with the heritage and with each other is lost. It actually only happens when grassroots challenge these official regulations. So in summary, what I want to express with this is that the laws that are intended to protect Arca as a cultural monument just tailor a narrative based on partial meanings. There are politically manipulated and that really restrict the naturally diverse, dynamic, fluid, and intangible heritage occurring around the Arco itself. And that's a phenomenon that occurs in many different sites and at different levels too, all across the country. I just chose this one because it's very palpable. Furthermore, conservationism is closely tied to the adoption of cultural heritage nationalist principles, and the goal of nationalism is to retain heritage within the national borders and to have this unshared control over the heritage narratives. And that is exactly what is happening in Guatemala. These laws designate that only the state has the ability to oversee heritage nomination, protection, access, and display. These laws also invoke political warrants to account for the enforcement of heritage policies. And they use this heritage narrative to boost the sense of belonging and national identity. And that is how, by concocting this unified, therefore biased, official narrative that is catered by and for the elites, heritage fulfills their political agendas. Meanwhile, the ideological structure, this word is difficult for me, the legitimizes indigenous values, interests, and worldviews. The establishment of this westernized, conservative, institutional scientism that supposedly advocates for public good, the national and social interest, and the Guatemalan identity is questionable. Whose interests are actually put first, and whose identity is being built and defended? The laws of Guatemala manufacture a national identity that does not recognize or integrate the vast ethnic diversity conforming the Guatemalan population. In fact, the heritage system seems to target the most vulnerable sector in the country, which is the indigenous communities. The discordance between the ethical codes of those experts and the others, and the exclusive legitimation of the state values ultimately disempower the local communities, perpetuate the colonial stereotypes, guilt indigenous peoples for carrying on with their traditional lives, and also criminalizes those non-state approved, although clearly traditional and cultural specific experiences. The critical linguistic study of the laws of Guatemala, therefore, it shows that the legal framework meant to protect the cultural heritage of the country is at the service of the state to fulfill political and economic agendas. The forced detachment of local communities from their heritage and the renovated victimization of the indigenous population, as I said before, it's especially grievous in Guatemala, considering that 83% of the victims of the Civil War were rural indigenous communities. Ultimately, what I've seen here is that the heritage laws of Guatemala are just another instrument that is brandished by the state for aggrandizing the social gaps based on class, race, and ethnicity. In conclusion, therefore, this critical discourse analysis of the laws of Guatemala, what it reveals is a systematic issue that is entrenched in the very core of the legal system of the country, and particularly in the heritage side of it. It is laudable that the heritage laws were written and were issued during that war period frame and post-war very recently. However, I think and I believe it's now the time for the population to gain the reins again and launch a new model that is more inclusive, that it's fair, and that is sustainable, and especially that recognizes, honors, and protects the basic human rights of the Guatemalan citizens. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Are there anyone with questions, comments?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gil. It was very informative. My question is this: in your view, what role should an educational institution play when confronted with abuses of human rights in societies they are serving? Perhaps in case of Guatemala, how did they adapt to providing education to students under these conditions?
Right. Well, thank you so much for your question. It's really interesting. And unfortunately, I have not good news. So as I said, Guatemala is still in the process of healing after a very traumatic period. And from what my understanding is that they are struggling to make the population able to have this public access to education. Nevertheless, y'all have to understand Guatemala has a very significant rural population, and most of the times they might not have access to regulated education. Therefore, I want to believe that they are in the workings, and especially as they finally get to overcome the post-war period. Some of them, they still believe they are in the post-war situation. So they are getting out of there. And hopefully by the next few decades, a government that is interested in its population, it's going to get in charge and, make sure that their children are informed of, on the one hand, the significance of heritage, of protecting, of being involved with the past and with the present and the future generations as well. But at the same time, just with their cultural identity, which is not necessarily the same as the national identity. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, unless there are any more questions, we can move on to our next speaker, Kerem AK. Kerem AK lives in Germany and studies American literature, American studies. He holds a bachelor degree from Ankara University in English literature, and he worked as a lecturer at various institutions, private and state. So yes, Kerem AK.
Thanks for the introduction. And I have a presentation. I believe you see it right now.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Firstly, warm greetings from Germany to everyone in Istanbul. Before starting, I'd like to express my appreciation to Topkapı University for having me here with you today. So far, it has been, this conference has been replete with insightful presentations about human rights and literature. During the following 15 minutes, I also intend to provide you one. The idea of today's presentation is in fact coming from the term paper that I wrote for the early American political fiction seminar in the Leibniz University of Hanover. I simply revisited and restudied my term paper to make it ready for this conference about human rights and literature. In this presentation, I will take a look at the early stages of women's rights over a late 18th century novel written by Gilbert Imlay. He was a businessman, diplomat, and then American author, but he is best known for his love affair with the early women's rights advocate Mary Wollstonecraft. Surely, I'm not intending to give you a gossip talk here. Rather, I'm interested in the influence of Wollstonecraft in Imlay's fictional work. But before that, I'd like to give you the contents of this presentation. Imlay's The Emigrants is a book written after the revolutions happened in the United States and France. For this reason, I'll start the presentation first with the question, how was life in both sides of the Atlantic during the last decade of the 18th century? Then, in parallel with the idea that books facilitated the transatlantic communication between European countries and the New World, I'll discuss Gilbert Imley's book in the context of women's rights, such as legal status and laws related to marriage and divorce. Having said all these, I'd like to begin my presentation by describing the life in both sides of the Atlantic after the revolutions. What I mean by the phrase after the revolution, I take the 1789 French Revolution as a starting point. The reason for that is that The Emigrants was published 4 years later after the French Revolution, namely in the year 1793. But France was not the only revolutionary country back then. A little bit earlier than that, there was also the American Revolutionary Movement campaigned against the British Empire. After the revolution, France was dealing with political and social issues with the help of guillotine. On the other hand, the United States was in search for securing and improving its borders through waging wars or buying out the masses of land. On one hand, we have politics of fear. On the other hand, we have politics of money. And the biggest empire of the century, the British Empire, trusted spies and government officials in order to block the spread of radical and revolutionary thoughts in its public sphere. In literary sphere, sentimentalism, or Empfindsamkeit in German, meaning the state of being emotional or sensitive, was a quite popular literary praxis during the late 18th century. In their books, sentimentalist writers prioritize emotions rather than reason. And this sentimental mode of literature even survived the following century. The earlier sentimentalist writers communicated emotions and feelings by giving less importance to reason. But how can arouse emotions and ignite feelings? In what form of literature is capable of doing that? The epistolary novel did the job. The literary form of writing letters is also the case for the form of Imley's fictional book. And the book, in fact, is a rich book in terms of the historical debates that were dealt in the book. To name few, we have legal equality, political rights, abolitionist rhetoric, captivity narrative, the question of women, equal education, rights of marriage and divorce, and so on. The book consists of 73 letters exchanged among a character carrying a similar name with the author, Mr. Ilri, his friend, Mr. Arlton, a British immigrant family, and their relatives. Sorry. Among these, the daughter of the British immigrant father, Miss Caroline, is a particularly an interesting and dynamic character. She's a young white British woman who immigrates to the New World but gets captivated by the natives. But soon after, she was rescued by Mr. Ilri's friend, Mr. Arlton. Following this rescue, Mr. Arlton gets distracted by Miss Caroline and her female body with tender limbs. Here, woman body is portrayed as an erotic spectacle, a recurring theme in the slave narratives of the time. Leaving aside this, of course, there is much more to be said about Miss Caroline. In the earlier part of the novel, she holds a conservative perspective on life. But after hearing the stories of her sister's neglected husband and her uncle's complex affair with a married woman who was constantly tyrannized by his husband, she transforms into a more radical and reformist character. After that, she acts quickly to demand unalienable rights for women, or the rights that cannot be changed or taken away. With this, she evokes the ideas of the late 18th century British women rights advocate, Mary Wollstonecraft. In her influential vindication of the rights of women, Wollstonecraft criticizes the legal condition of women by comparing it to prostitution and demands for fair educational standards for women. Quote, if they or women were educated in a more orderly manner, which might save many from common and legal prostitution, women wouldn't then marry for a support. It's a melancholy truth, yet such is the blessed effect of civilization. The most respectable women are the most oppressed, end quote. Even though Imlay included Wollstonecraft's ideas in the book, it's hard to say that Imlay dealt with women's rights in a true revolutionary spirit. In a way, the book reproduces the dominant gender roles of the time by failing to imagine a truly liberal society whose members are equal by the law. In the book, we have a description of this imaginary society to be founded in the New World. Through the following two consecutive letters exchanged between Mr. Arlton and Mr. Ilry, we can make sense of this new and liberal society in comparison with Britain. Mr. Arlton from Louisville, America writes, quote, as the government of this district is not organized, it's my intention to form in epitome the model of society, whose members shall be eligible to seat in a House of Representatives consisting of 20 members, who are to assemble every Sunday in the year. The respectability of every citizen be established upon the broad basis of dignity of men, end quote. By touching on the condition of women in Britain, Mr. Ilry from London replies, quote, nature has its bounds and vigor is the concomitant of temperance and exercise. And the charms of fine women can only be relished by men who have not enervated by luxury and debauchery. And thus it has happened in every populous and wealthy city in the world, whose importance was as disgusting as their caprices were unbounded. House quote, for the better portrayal of women in Britain, Mr. Ilry gives an example of a troubled marriage. Continue quote. Mrs. F couldn't be entitled to a bill of divorce without she could either prove Mr. F's impotence or infidelity, end quote. What do these two quotes tell about Imlay's The Emigrants? Firstly, Imlay makes it clear that Britain stood firm and conservative in its stance against more reformist divorce laws. In other words, only rich women in Britain were able to divorce their husbands, but poor and middle-class women could not do the same, even if their husbands commit adultery or cheating, or leave them or show acts of violence on them. In return, Imlay proposes a more equal society to be founded in the New World. And where would it be exactly? In the state of Kentucky. The marked area on this map on your screens shows Kentucky. Its northern borders follow the Ohio River, and its western border touches on the banks of the Mississippi River. So to say, Kentucky was famous for its natural beauties, its rich soil for agriculture, its closeness to the rivers, convenient for sea transport. With these aspects, Kentucky just seems to be the perfect spot for Pantocrates' description of a small but equal society to be founded out in the nature. Who exactly are these Pantocrates? Yeah. The very first Pantocrates were the famous Romantic poets, namely Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey. Both poets are also known as the Lake poets of the 18th century, since they lived in the Lake District of England, which you can see this district on your screens. The Pantocratic idea was simple: to form a small society whose members govern themselves out in the nature as an alternative to the real but unequal world. For several reasons, such as disagreeing the exact location of this imaginary society, and also doubts about the idea itself, pantsocracy occupied merely the mental space, not an actual mass of land. But the idea never lost its popularity for a long time. In fact, it was a part of the popular genre called travel literature. In this genre, there are several writers and poets and their works published in the 18th century, and these books generally were seen as pieces of nature writing or travel memoirs, so to speak. In this context, Gilbert Imley's fictional work, The Emigrants, falls into the category of travel literature. But he wrote two books, and he wrote these two books for the British public. So to say, The Emigrants wasn't his first book. The first one is the book called A Topographical Description of the Western Territory of North America, which is on the left. And the other one, as you already know, The Emigrants on the right. The first book sold itself with its detailed geographical descriptions of Kentucky and received mostly positive reviews from the British press, while the second book, The Emigrants, was more like a fiction than a mere geography book. But The Emigrants failed to generate much more favorable opinions in reviews. And because of that, it's totally understandable to ask the question, is it a good novel? The Emigrants mostly, as I said earlier, received mainly negative reviews because the book carries obvious traces from the genre sentimental novel that was extremely popular. In the late 18th century, but this genre was seen as something women would read, and therefore the sentimental novels tended to be dismissed as something feminine. Additionally, written for the British public, the book imagines a secessionist or independent society to be established free from the American revolutionary spirit and the British influence. Because this society carried some radical and revolutionary aspects that we also find in the French Revolution, the book was not welcomed the same as Imley's previous unfictional book. Moving to the conclusion, despite its shortcomings and limitations, Gilbert Imley's sentimental novel, The Emigrants, provides insightful perspectives on the historical debates of the time. In a way, the letters in the book document the transatlantic intellectual communication during the post-revolutionary era. And even though the book reproduces the dominant gender roles of its time and fails to add something new to the question of women in its relatively equal utopia, it somehow ushers us to hear the voices of fair demands for a better life without double standards. That was the end of the presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And are there anyone with questions and comments for Kerem AK? Okay. It seems that there are no questions. All right, then. Thank you. Kerem AK,
You're welcome.
for joining us tonight. Yes, so we can move on to our last speaker, Gülten SİLİNDİR KERETLİ. Let me give you brief information about her. She studied English at Çankaya University in Ankara, and she received her PhD from Atılım University, again in Ankara, and she was a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. She currently teaches at 7 December University in Turkey, in Kilis region. And her research focuses on post-colonial feminism, gender studies, experimental theater, philosophy, and avant-garde, yes, experimental theater, yes. So, Gülten SİLİNDİR KERETLİ, it's your turn. Okay.
Good.
We are ready. Yes, we are
Can you hear
ready.
me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Actually, I'm having a trouble with my computer, so I had to turn it my mobile phone. Now I have to manage the camera settings because it says that I'm very sorry for the trouble.
No, okay, no problem, no problem. Take your time.
I will just check the camera.
No problem.
Okay. Have a nice evening. I'm very sorry.
Hello. No problem.
I'm really sorry.
Everything is fine. Don't worry.
I'm trying to connect from my computer, but it's really not working right now. So I had to turn my mobile phone. So can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
I got sick. I have sore throat, so I'm not feeling very well, and also sorry for that. Okay, may I begin?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, my topic is Harold Pinter. So I would like to first of all introduce him to you. I know all of you maybe know him. He's a playwright. He's a British playwright. He's a screenwriter and director and actor. And he's a Nobel Prize winner. And he is one of the most influential modern British dramatists with a writing career and spent more than 50 years. As you all know, my topic is about his Nobel Prize lecture, which he gave in 2005. Its name is Art, Truth, and Politics. This video was delivered in 2005 in literature. Harold Pinter, who was at the time hospitalized and unable to travel to Stockholm, so delivered it in person. It was a lecture which was projected on 3 large screens in front of the Ovidians and the Swedish Academy in Stockholm on the evening of December. It was simultaneously transmitted on channel, the digital television channel in the United Kingdom, where it was introduced by Pinter's friend and playwright David Hare. Soon after its videotape, the delivery, the full text and the video formats were posted for the public on Nobel Prize. A privately printed limited edition, Art, Truth, and Politics, was published also in 2006. It was published in the Essential Pinter by Grove Press. Okay, I have to skip this part. Okay, the recordings of Pinter's Nobel lecture are produced and distributed by Illuminations.
To be resumed. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, he was also, you know, a chairman of PEN World Voices, shown publicly in the United States. And Pinter asserts that political language as used by politicians does not venture into any of this territory, since the majority of politicians, on the evidence available to us, are not interested in truth, but in power, maintenance of that power. To maintain the power, it's essential that people remain in ignorance, and they live in the ignorance of truth, even the truth of their own lives. What surrounds us, therefore, is a vast tapestry of lies upon which we feed. The truth is something entirely different. A truth is to do with how the United States understands its role in the world and how it chooses to embody it. Okay. Harold Pinter also says that even while it was happening, it was not happening. It didn't matter. It was of no interest. The crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide. I put to you that the United States is without doubt the greatest show on the road. Brutal, indifferent, scornful, ruthless. It may be, but it is also very clever. As a salesman, it's out on its own. Its most saleable commodity is self-love. It's a winner. Listen to all American presidents on television say the verse. The American people, as in the sentence, I say to the American people, it's time to pray, defend the rights of American people. Okay, I talked about his Nobel speech. Now I want to skip to the place, pass to the place of his, he's over the political place. One of them is party time, the other one is New World Order. I would like to talk about I'd like to talk about, first of all, the party time. His play, which was published in 1992, Party Time, provides a social criticism of Britain in the wake of 1980s and the beginning of 1990s. The play is about the portrayal of two dissimilar worlds, one dominated by the power-hungry ruling elite of 8 people, and the other represented by an offstage group of state victims who are tortured on the street for no apparent reasons. In the play, the artificial conversation of the petit bourgeois characters about the luxurious leisure activities is juxtaposed with the violence exercised on the protesters outside. Although the word party in the title of the play refers to a joyous, mirthful event, the idea of celebration turns out to be in contrast with the atrocious and menacing underlying feeling on the outside. The fact that the power to rule the state is only in the hands of a small group of elite in the play, and Party Time displays an unjust society, a degraded mob ruled by a power-crazed elite. In this regard, the play employs the depiction of unequal society in crisis, as it consists of 2 groups divided from each other, both economically and ideologically. Whereas the upper class characters are ironically the only ones who enjoy the right to discuss the political matters, the concern of the protesters on the street is not even on their agenda. The criticism of monopoly of power in capitalist states, where the difference between the rich and the poor, as it is highest, is indicated in Fred's ambiguous remark, where Charlotte, who wants to learn what's happening on the outside. Charlotte says, I think there is something going on in the street. Fred says, leave the street to us. Charlotte, who is us? Fred, oh, just us, you know. This remark, which points to an emergent discrepancy between the groups of people who share the same society, aims to depoliticize the masses who are, at least curious about the problems of people from another class. Since the group is characterized by the lack of contact with the outside world, where others are exposed to violence. Cave suggests that bourgeoisie is there to celebrate their supposed superiority and absolute right to rule, a statement which implies that the members of the group are supporters of the establishment. Mary Luckhurst considers them as the henchmen of the regime. An evident class-based social structure in party time is used as a tool for social criticism. The play's identity politics concerning class is made evident at the beginning with a scene in which a waiter is serving the elite group of guests that are about to enjoy their night without thinking any heat of the barricade going on the outside. Michael Billington, who writes the autobiography of Harold Pinter, suggests that what Pinter aspires to criticize in this play and illustrate is that our lives are increasingly governed by an apolitical materialism in which it's uncool to get up about injustice and corruption. The fact that members of the party are insensible towards the ills of society is revealed through the meaningless speech about the facilities appealing to the class, good dresses, and the appearance. Such scenes indicate that existence of strong class consciousness among the upper class. However, it's far from representing any bond of fraternity, as their relationships appear to be based on common benefits and a concern for ostentation as seen in Lizz's pride in being a member of the club. Is it silly to say I feel proud? I mean to be part of the society's beautifully dressed people. Despite their pride, this class consciousness fails to serve solidarity among that particular group and does not in any way refer to the coexistence within society. With such examples, Pinter approaches the problem of class division and discontent and tries to prove the idea, the seemingly innocent desire to belong to a group and play one part in an ordered society can never be wholly free of political exploitation. And the impulse to participate and comfort of sharing ethical values can degenerate into the rejection and castigation of those. This explanation serves a very appropriate reason as to why Pinter almost parodized the artificial relationship of the members of the elite club based on the economic benefits. Ironically enough, despite the upper class lack of attention to the cause of protesters on the streets, Gavin seems to be responsible for the violence during the barricade as he works for the government. As a disapproved concept in works of art, state power is attributed to Gavin in this play, like in another play, Run for the Road, the character of Nicholas. Most probably, he is behind the state torture outside, but isolates his distinguished members from the issue to keep them apolitical by directing the attention to the subjects. The torture conceivably initiated by Gavin along with other offstage state figures and reinforced by the support of the members of the club like Terry, who threatens the dissenters decisively. We could suffocate every single one of you at his given signal. We could shove a broomstick up each individual ours at another given signal. And we could poison all the mother's milk in the world so that every baby will drop dead before it opened its perverted bloody mouth. As Terry's sinister discourse reveals, the language used by the authority figures as state conveys a political message that powerful are invariably the cruel ones. As a tour de force, as you know, Harold Pinter is an anarchist playwright. Terry states how easy it's to sacrifice the different ones, threaten the alleged unity of the class. This scene demonstrates the horrific and sadistic practices and arbitrarily used by the state power against individuals in case of any attempt of objection and outcry. The fact that the socialities lead the state in the direction they choose is denounced as an act of despotism in party time. Existence of a totalitarian regime that is born out of a desire for complete control over the hearts and bodies, minds and souls, and the citizens of the nations is hinted in Douglas' talk in favor of the so-called peace with clenched fists. We want peace and we are going to get it, but we want that peace to be cast iron. No leaks, no droughts, cast iron. tight as a drum. That's the kind of peace we want, a cast iron peace. Ironically enough, the use of these words while defining peace in the scene proves the idea that weapon used by authority figures and justifies Pinter's belief that language employed by rulers is used to masquerade, manipulate, and deceive others. Do we have time, Hocam? Enough time?
Not very much, actually.
Because I have another play and a poem.
Oh, that, well, I'm not sure that will be like too much, maybe.
Okay, then I should conclude my remarks.
We totally got the idea, so yeah.
Thank you. In party time, the use of double speak, another Orwellian concept that refers to a state of incongruity between what is said and what is actually meant. An example of this device is illustrated in the scene where Terry speaks of the harmonious unity in their club, as opposed to the chaos on the outside. You won't find voices raised in our club. People don't do vulgar, sordid, offensive things. And if they do, we kick them in the balls and chuck them down the stairs with no trouble at all. This speak implies that the so-called lack of voice in Terry's club, actually, and it refers that no dissenting opinion is allowed there. The club is not all-embracing at all, and it surrounds people who share the same economic background and ideological standing. They persecuted central figure of the regime in party time as another pointer of the state is Dusty's brother Jimmy. Okay, I also want to talk about my other play, New World Order. New World Order is a political strategy that began with the official address of George Bush to the US Congress. We stand today at a unique, extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf is grave, and it also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. One of these troubled times, and our fifth objective and New World Order can emerge a new era, says Bush. And these lines are a direct reference to what two torturers, Des and Lionel, are saying to each other in the New World Order. While a blindfolded victim is seated there, they were talking about, as Bush did, a new world order that is on the way and hasn't begun yet. Lionel says, that's right, we haven't finished with him. We haven't even begun. We haven't finished with his wife either. And Des says, we haven't even begun. Pinter has depicted his firm stand as an anti-imperialist in different contexts, from the imperial role of America in Latin American countries. Pinter tries to focus his protest on areas while he feels Britain and the West have a direct responsibility. He says it is certainly true that the East, Central America, Latin America, Turkey, we give them money, arms, weapons, and all kinds. The press, individuals, organizations, political parties going to keep silence and doing something about it. I can't just stop with them all these things, says Billington. As a Nobel Prize winner in 2005, he depicted his role as an anti-imperialist and severely condemned the military presence of the United States and Britain in Iraq. He depicted the role in Iraq as an act of blatant state terrorism in which thousands of innocent people were killed. The invasion of Iraq was an bandit act, an act of blatant state terrorism, demonstrating the absolute contempt for the concept of international law. The invasion was an arbitrary military action inspired by a series of lie upon lies, gross manipulation of the media, therefore of the public, an act intended to consolidate American military and economic control of the Middle East. And overall, I want to conclude my presentation. Harold Pinter holds an undisputed place in front of ranks of contemporary playwrights, and these two plays, Party Time and New World Order, work in chilling tandem, each demonstrating the inevitable brutality that comes with total conviction of right. Party Time is a terrifying portrait of indifference of privileged class, and the cruelty engendered in its members by political disruption and the merciless extinction of dissent. At an elegant cocktail party, stylish bourgeoisie discusses the country clubs and summer homes, which below industries a sinister military presence protects them from the unmentionable horrors of poverty, vulgarity. In the New World Order, two interrogators, Des and Lyonnais, harass a man whom they condemn for his questioning of received ideas, whom we know only as a threat to the closed vision of democracy. Thank you for listening and for your patience, because I was the last presenter.
No, we are very happy to have you here, Gülten, SİLİNDİR, KERETLİ. Thank you very much for your very interesting speech presentation. And does anyone have any questions for Gülten KERETLİ's presentation? Any comments?
I'm really sorry for the computer. It didn't work, hocam, so I had to open it.
No, it's okay. It's fine. No, it's fine. Do you have any questions, comments?
Actually, Erel Pinter was known as a, he is very famous for Comedy of Menace and for his memory plays, but he's not known for his political plays. It's very rare, and they don't know about his overtly political plays. So I wanted to introduce him as a different angle, hocam.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for doing that. And we immensely enjoyed it. And I personally love his plays. Erel Pinter is, I think he's great. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the being a part of this organization. Thank you for accepting.
You're welcome. Yes, you just heard our last speakers, and now we are drawing to a close. First of all, I want to apologize for my camera. It decided to show me pink in pink color. I am thankful to all participants. Thank you for your endeavor, for your time. I really appreciate it. We heard really very interesting, very impressive presentations about diverse topics from 18th century British novel to Guatemalan heritage and African fiction and so many. So thank you all. I am thankful to my colleagues for enabling this conference, for their help, for their time. Yes, now I would like to put Furkan Tezcan Hoca on, and he will briefly inform you about the abstract, publication of the abstracts.
So is my voice clear enough?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so for closing, Professor Fermâ has already sort of made the closing remarks, but on behalf of the organizing committee, and I'm going to name all four of us, so Professor Dr. Fermâ, Assistant Professor Dr. Elvan KARAMAN MEZ, Research Assistant Seray Dayzar, and myself, I'd like to express our gratitude to our plenary speakers, first Professor Semdap and Professor DAWES, to all the academics who contributed with their abstracts and presentation, and of course to the audience members and our students for having shown interest in the conference. And for the first iteration of any conference, I sincerely believe that we could not have had a better outcome. So thank you to all of you for making it happen. And I'd like to give a quick heads up for the presenters. So the book of abstracts will be electronically published by Istanbul Topkapı University Press. Also, the conference sessions will be uploaded on our university's YouTube channel, and both a copy of the book of abstracts and the YouTube link will be emailed to the presenters as soon as possible, hopefully sometime toward the end of next week. We'll also include in those emails certificates of appreciation for our plenary speakers and certificates of participation for our presenters. So before we all leave, and if you're available, I'd ask that you turn on your turn on your cameras and have a few group photographs. So I'm going to take screenshots. So try to have a pose that is comfortable because it's going to take several seconds. And we have 2 pages of our participants. So let me take a few of them. So I've just taken one. Let me take a second one. All right, so thank you so much. By the way, I will be posting these photographs on our English department Instagram account. If you'd like to follow it, it's topkapı.ell, stands for English Language and Literature. So for the last time, thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Bye.